The Civil War ended, but the violence did not. That is the necessary truth we bury deep beneath the monuments and the anthems. The year is 1865. 4 years of slaughter had just ceased, yet America was not healed. It was merely hushed. The sound of cannon fire was replaced by the low, grating whisper of anxiety, a fear that the foundational rot exposed by the war had not been excised, only briefly masked. Look closely at the face of victory. It is scarred. The North had won, securing the Union and, theoretically, freedom for 4 million people. But victory is a shallow grave. It promises order, yet breeds a new kind of chaos, the chaos of opportunity. The national trauma had pulverized the old social order, leaving behind an economic vacuum and political dust storm. Into this the parasites moved. Reconstruction was the grand experiment, the attempt to rebuild a nation not merely physically, but morally. It was a noble mandate, heavy with the weight of blood spilled. For a brief, terrifying moment, the future seemed malleable, uncertain, and filled with a potent, intoxicating hope. This was a fragile hope, built on the premise that men, especially those in power, were fundamentally good. History, however, has a savage tendency to punish naivety. The psychological landscape of the post-war American was defined by two opposing forces. First, the paranoia of the defeated South, convinced that their entire way of life was being extinguished by federal tyranny. Second, the exhaustion of the victorious North, desperate to return to profit and peace, eager to look away from the moral complexities of true equality. This vast emotional chasm was the perfect breeding ground for a shadow economy, a conspiracy that would ultimately prove more corrosive than any battlefield defeat. The documents reveal a new kind of fear. This fear was not of invasion, but of invisibility. Of the government official who could look you in the eye, shake your hand, and simultaneously be robbing you blind. The war had taught the nation two critical lessons about power. It was absolute, and it was often cruel. Now, the powerful understood a third lesson. It was transactional. The focus turns to Washington, D.C., a city rebuilt on swampy ground and high ambition. The air was thick not just with humidity, but with the stench of quick money and insider deals. Congress, tasked with healing the Union, often seemed preoccupied with feeding its own insatiable hunger. Every piece of legislation, every federal contract, every appointment to the new Internal Revenue Service, IRS, was viewed not as a tool of governance, but as a negotiable commodity. The sheer scale of the federal government's financial reach during and immediately after the war was unprecedented. The war effort had necessitated massive internal taxation, most notably the excise tax on liquor and tobacco, the foundation of the government's immense, immediate income. For the first time, ordinary Americans felt the government's hand directly in their pocket. This taxation was meant to fund the future. Instead, it became the prize. Think of the newly created Internal Revenue Service. It was supposed to be the vigilant guardian of the national purse. But in the chaos of the Gilded Age, it became a sprawling, decentralized bureaucracy staffed largely by political appointees who owed their loyalty not to the flag, but to the party bosses who gave them their jobs. These offices, in major cities like New York, Chicago, and our central focus, St. Louis, were ripe for infiltration. They were the unguarded vault. Pause and consider this image. Picture the vast empty Treasury building in Washington, its marble halls echoing with promises of fiscal rectitude. Now superimpose upon that image the back rooms of St. Louis distilleries, choked with the sweet, heavy fumes of fermenting grain, where the real calculations were being made, not of distillation yield, but of corruption yield. The average citizen, weary from war, wanted a hero, a simple moral anchor. They found him in Ulysses S. Grant. Grant. The name alone carried the weight of historical destiny. The general who demanded unconditional surrender. The man who had choked the life out of the Confederacy. In 1868, he was swept into the presidency on a tide of near-religious reverence. The people craved his simple, honest presence. He was the sword of the Republic, untainted by the political maneuvering of pre-war Washington. But here's the detail that truly matters. The very qualities that made Grant a magnificent general, his unquestioning loyalty to his subordinates, his preference for simple solutions, his inability to suspect treachery in those he trusted, made him a catastrophically vulnerable president. He saw the world in black and white in clear lines of battle and command. The whiskey ring operated in the psychological gray areas of friendship, obligation, and silent debt. Grant surrounded himself with men he knew, men who had served him well during the war. He trusted loyalty above competence or experience. It was a medieval mindset in a modern, cutthroat age. This deep, almost fatal trust was exactly what the emerging conspiracy needed. A screen of unimpeachable authority behind which they could operate with impunity. The most powerful man in the world, the one figure meant to safeguard the nation's integrity, was inadvertently providing its cover. The stage is set. The money is flowing. The exhausted public is looking away. And the most trusted man in America has inadvertently opened the gates. The transition from hope to horror had quietly begun. The unfinished nation was about to receive its most painful lesson. Betrayal often wears the uniform of a friend. The rot begins with a number. 70 cents, that was the federal excise tax, levied on every gallon of distilled liquor. For the distillers who were mass-producing tens of thousands of gallons a month, this tax was not merely an expense. It was the largest operational cost and, simultaneously, the single greatest source of potential illegal profit. Consider the simple, brutal arithmetic. If a distiller could hide just 100 gallons from the government's ledgers in a single week, they instantly pocketed $70, untaxed and clean. Scale that by thousands of gallons, multiply it by dozens of distilleries across the Midwest, and the cash flow quickly escalates into sums that defy honest imagination. This was not petty theft. This was the systematic dismantling of the national treasury, one hidden barrel at a time. The psychological manipulation began with compliance. The law required the distillery to affix a tax stamp to every barrel before it left the premises. This simple visual artifact was the only proof the government had that the tax had been paid. The ring's first brilliant move was to corrupt the men who physically handled these stamps, the revenue agents. These agents were supposed to be the eyes of the Treasury, the first line of defense. Instead, they became the first line of attack. The seduction was swift and highly effective. An agent earned a meager salary, enough to live but not enough to dream. The distillers, often men of immense local wealth and influence, approached them with offers that were not just cash payments, but life upgrades. A better house, private school for the children, the sudden ability to purchase that newfangled automobile. They weren't just being bribed, they were being offered an escape from the anxiety of middle-class struggle. The price of their soul was simply to look away. But here is the detail that truly matters. The corruption was never a simple bribe. It was an insurance policy. The distillers, the true architects of the ring, ensured that the agents themselves became deeply implicated. Once an agent had accepted the first payment, they were not just a partner in crime. They were a vulnerable asset. Their compliance was guaranteed not by trust but by fear of exposure. The ring had dossiers on its own people. Betrayal meant not just losing a job but facing ruin and prison. A complete psychological entrapment. This feeling of entrapment spread like a contagion through the entire structure. The revenue agent reported to the supervisor of internal revenue, an even higher political appointee. To ensure the safety of the entire operation, the supervisor had to be bought or eliminated. In the crucial Midwestern hub of St. Louis, this position was held by a man who would become the human heart of the conspiracy, John McDonald. McDonald was a war veteran, a handsome, charming figure who cultivated a deep personal loyalty to President Grant. He was politically ambitious and utterly devoid of moral scruples. He used his personal relationship with the president as a shield, ensuring that any suspicion directed his way could be dismissed as an attack on Grant himself. He didn't just accept bribes, he structured them. He created the syndicate. The syndicate was a complex administrative matrix of corruption. McDonald organized the distillers, demanding a standard payoff, usually about 35 cents for every 70 cents owed to the government. This half-cut allowed the distillers to double their profit margin while keeping McDonald and his political handlers incredibly wealthy. McDonald's brilliance lay in standardizing the robbery, making it predictable, safe, and most importantly, invisible to casual inspection. Pause and consider this image. Imagine McDonald's office in St. Louis, not as a government post but as a medieval toll booth. He wasn't collecting taxes, he was collecting tribute. The tax stamps, the visible signs of compliance, were being reused or purchased wholesale from corrupt federal printers and applied to endless barrels of untaxed whiskey. The paper trail, the supposed evidence of legality, was itself a lie. The corruption flowed outward, connecting the local distillers and agents to the highest echelons of power in Washington. McDonald needed protection at the presidential level. Someone who could quash investigations before they started. Someone who could guarantee the right judicial appointments. Someone who had the president's ear every single day. This connection, this ultimate vulnerability in the nation's integrity, was found in Orville E. Babcock. Babcock was President Grant's personal secretary, a man who lived in the White House, handled all of the president's personal and political correspondence, and served as the physical conduit to the executive office. He was, in essence, the gatekeeper to the most powerful man in the world. For McDonald and the Ring, Babcock was the essential Washington node, the ultimate insurance policy against the chaos they were creating. The narrative shifts from simple greed to a profound psychological terror. The American taxpayer was funding the lavish lifestyles of these conspirators, but worse, the government itself was participating in the confidence trick. The high hopes of Reconstruction were not being undermined by defeated Confederates, but by the very men tasked with securing the peace and the national treasury. The failure was not one of war, but of trust. The fear, the anxiety that resonated with the American populace then and now, is the realization that the system designed to protect you is, in fact, the most potent weapon being used against you. The Ring did not fear the law because they owned the men who enforced it. They lived in a world where justice was a service they could afford to cancel. The conspiracy's greatest asset wasn't cash. It was proximity. John McDonald understood that the fear of a scandal reaching the White House was a more effective deterrent to investigators than any amount of money. The relationship between McDonald and Orville Babcock, Grant's private secretary, was not merely a transactional one. It was a deeply entwined, almost fraternal bond forged on ambition and secrecy. McDonald would travel from St. Louis to Washington, D.C., and not simply check into a hotel. He would often stay at the White House, sometimes as a personal guest of Babcock. The irony is excruciating. The man masterminding the largest tax fraud in American history was sleeping under the same roof as the president, often dining at his table, and sharing small talk in the executive mansion. This access became the ring's psychological shield. An investigator, no matter how zealous, would think twice and then a third time before moving against a man who could summon the president's personal secretary with a mere cough. The unspoken threat was clear. To touch MacDonald was to insult Grant. This intimate access meant information flowed both ways, often carried by Babcock in coded messages or disguised personal requests. When the Treasury Department would attempt an initial, timid inquiry into the St. Louis revenue offices, Babcock would receive the preliminary reports before Secretary of the Treasury was fully briefed. He could then dispatch a warning to MacDonald, allowing the ring to temporarily clean up their ledgers, move their untaxed liquor, or simply stall the investigation with bureaucratic friction. The documents reveal a new kind of fear, the chilling realization that the system was being used to police itself, and the police were the criminals, the very architecture of the White House. The symbol of American rectitude was acting as a control center for a national criminal enterprise. This psychological subversion, the sanctuary becoming the source of infection, is what gave the whiskey ring its terrifying power. It wasn't just corruption. It was a spiritual betrayal of the post-war hope for a clean slate. The money itself was transported in ways that defied both belief and scrutiny. Cash was often laundered through private banking channels or transported in satchels disguised as routine correspondence. A famous chilling account describes money being delivered to Babcock, wrapped inside packages of cigars, or even tucked into copies of the Congressional Record. The banal packaging of the betrayal amplified the crime. The very tools of democratic governance, documents, records, the Post were being used as vessels for the wages of conspiracy. Pause and consider this image. Picture a late-night meeting in the White House library. A quiet conversation between Babcock and a ring courier, the dark wood and leather of the room absorbing the silent transfer of thousands of dollars. Outside, the American people sleep, confident in the integrity of their newly reunited government. This image encapsulates the true horror of the Gilded Age, the profound disconnect between the myth of democracy and the reality of its operation. The ring's influence extended into the press. Key newspapers in major cities were either subtly co-opted or outright bought. When the first murmurs of scandal began to surface, the news outlets controlled by ring associates would immediately publish counter-stories, labeling the accusers as disgruntled employees, political enemies, or, more chillingly, agents of the defeated South trying to discredit the Union war hero, Grant. This propaganda campaign turned the media into a weapon, twisting the truth into a shield for the conspirators. The citizen who tried to follow the story was immediately gaslighted, forced to question whether the evidence they saw was real or simply fake news manufactured by political rivals. This engineered confusion was key to their survival. But here is the detail that truly matters. The tragedy of President Grant is that he was not an active participant in the fraud, but a willful dupe. He was profoundly insecure in his civilian role and clung fiercely to the few men he felt were unconditionally loyal. When confronted with accusations against Babcock, his reaction was not to investigate, but to defend. He saw the attack on his aide as a continuation of the war, a personal attack on him. His loyalty, once his greatest strength on the battlefield, became a devastating blind spot in the executive office. This blind spot allowed the ring to grow exponentially. By the early 1870s, the conspiracy was draining millions of dollars annually from the Treasury, a staggering sum that could have funded hospitals, schools, and infrastructure desperately needed in the Reconstruction South. Instead, it was funding opulence, private yachts, lavish Washington mansions, and the endless political machine required to keep the circle of silence unbroken. The ring wasn't just stealing money. They were stealing the future of the American experiment. The psychological toll on the few honest men left in the Treasury Department was immense. They watched helplessly as their investigations were stonewalled, their reports were buried, and their careers were destroyed. They were fighting an enemy they couldn't see, one that had already captured the command center. Their hope of reconstruction had curdled into despair, leaving them with the haunting question: if the president's own house is corrupt, where does an honest man turn? The rot was so deep it had become normalized. In St. Louis, Chicago, Milwaukee, and New Orleans, the whiskey ring operated with the confidence of an established corporation. Their success bred a sense of invulnerability, a psychological state that often precedes a catastrophic fall. The conspirators became sloppy, arrogant, treating the government's money as their personal entitlement. They believed the protective armor of the White House was impenetrable. But in the vast labyrinthine bureaucracy of Washington, a small tremor of discontent was growing. It centered on a man who was initially considered part of the problem, but who would become the reluctant executioner of the ring: Benjamin Helm Bristow. Bristow was a Kentuckian, a committed unionist, and a man who possessed a severe, almost puritanical sense of duty. Grant appointed him as the new Secretary of the Treasury in 1874, primarily because he needed a competent, clean administrator after a series of minor scandals. Grant expected efficiency. He did not expect war. Bristow arrived in a department saturated with political appointees. Every collector, every supervisor, every key clerk owed their job to the machine. Bristow immediately felt the oppressive weight of the atmosphere, a quiet corporate chill that hinted at secrets. His initial audits revealed a systematic and inexplicable deficit in the excise tax collections, primarily in the Midwest. The numbers simply did not align with the known volume of liquor production. The story was being lied to by the spreadsheets themselves. Bristow was faced with a profound moral and strategic problem. If he launched a formal investigation through the established channels, the ring, thanks to Babcock, would be alerted instantly, and the evidence would vanish. To fight the conspiracy, he had to adopt the methods of the conspiracy: absolute secrecy and psychological manipulation. He began by creating his own private intelligence unit, an operation so compartmentalized that only he and a handful of trusted, hand-picked agents knew the full scope of their work. These agents were chosen for their anonymity and their absolute lack of political ties. They were, in effect, a covert black ops unit operating within the United States government, bypassing all official chains of command. This act was almost medieval in its political risk. If discovered, Bristow himself could be destroyed for insubordination and treason. But here is the detail that truly matters. Bristow's investigation was fueled not by righteous anger, but by a quiet, mounting dread. He was not just auditing books. He was hunting men who had the highest connections in the nation. He understood that the closer he got to the truth, the closer he got to the president himself. This created a high-stakes psychological drama. An honest man forced to stalk a political entity that could at any moment have him dismissed, discredited, or worse. The fear was palpable, a constant tension that only fueled his meticulous work. The first crucial breakthrough came when his agents, disguised as common laborers, traveling salesmen, and even distillery workers, developed a sophisticated method for tracking the actual movement of raw material and finished product. They ignored the official ledgers and focused on the physical evidence: the amount of grain shipped, the coal consumed by the stills, and the number of barrels physically leaving the distillery gates. They tracked the shadow economy not through paper, but through labor and logistics. Pause and consider this image. Picture one of Bristow's anonymous agents in the dead of a St. Louis winter, hiding in a freight yard, counting barrels being loaded onto a midnight train. Barrels that the official Treasury records claimed did not exist. This is the moment the tables began to turn. The secret government was finally being challenged by a greater, more determined secret government. The hunter had become the hunted. The information accumulated slowly, painstakingly. Telegrams were sent in private code. Evidence was stored in non-government safes, and every conversation was treated as potentially compromised. Bristow was building a case not just on finance but on trust disparity. Who did the evidence trust and whom did the government trust? The answer was increasingly, terrifyingly clear. The government trusted the thieves. The evidence began to point inexorably toward John MacDonald and his St. Louis syndicate. The scope was larger, the network more sophisticated, and the political protections higher than Bristow could have possibly imagined. The financial cost was now estimated to be in the millions, a fortune large enough to destabilize a small European power. But the psychological cost was greater. The evidence strongly suggested complicity from the very top. The final element needed for the operation was the element of surprise. Bristow knew that if he asked for permission to launch a major raid, the request would pass through the White House and be instantly leaked. He had to bypass the president's personal staff entirely. His plan was audacious, bordering on illegal. A coordinated, simultaneous strike across multiple cities executed by his own hand-picked men, without prior warning to the local federal marshals or even the U.S. Attorney General. The decision was made. The operation was codenamed Operation Distiller. In the wake of the bloodiest war the continent had ever known, America was not looking for a politician. It was looking for a savior. The post-war air was thick with political sulfur. Andrew Johnson, the accidental president, was a disaster, an immovable obstacle to reconstruction, an embodiment of the continuing national fracture. The American public felt raw, exposed, and desperate for an anchor, a figure of simplicity and unquestionable moral authority. They were weary of rhetoric, weary of idealism, and profoundly weary of uncertainty. What they craved was a strong hand. They found that hand in Ulysses S. Grant. His name alone was a talisman against chaos. He was the architect of unconditional surrender. He was the man who had faced the unimaginable horror of the battlefield and emerged, not broken, but silently, relentlessly victorious. He represented the uncomplicated virtue of duty. In the collective mind of the weary North, Grant was the ultimate pattern interrupt to the political confusion of Washington. His campaign slogan, "Let us have peace," was more than a political cry. It was a psychological plea. It was the desperate voice of a nation begging for the trauma to stop, for the complexities to resolve themselves into the clarity of military order. The people didn't want a nuanced debate on tariffs or civil rights. They wanted the war hero to bring the same crushing finality to the Capitol that he had brought to the Confederacy. But here is the detail that truly matters. Grant was a profoundly non-political animal. His genius lay in logistics, strategy, and the grim calculus of war. His understanding of the intricate backstabbing world of civilian politics was minimal. He viewed governance through the lens of a command structure. Loyalty was paramount. Subordinates were to be trusted implicitly, and criticism was often viewed as insubordination. This medieval mindset, applied to the modern, serpentine politics of the Gilded Age, created the greatest vulnerability the nation had ever faced. He entered the White House with a singular, fatal flaw. a deep, crippling insecurity regarding his civilian competence. This insecurity manifested as a fierce, almost tragic dependence on personal loyalty. He did not trust the smooth, professional politicians of the establishment. He trusted his friends. He trusted the men who had shared the brutal truths of war with him. Men whose loyalty was personal, not ethical. Pause and consider this image. Picture the general, surrounded by advisors, looking lost in the cavernous, ornate East Room of the White House. He is wearing the mantle of presidency, but his heart remains with the soldiers of the line. The power is his, yet he seeks comfort in the familiar faces of wartime cronies. The conspirators did not need to corrupt Grant's morality. They only needed to exploit his need for kinship. This need became the Whiskey Ring's greatest shield. The men he appointed to the highest levels of the Treasury, the customs houses, and the federal judiciary were not chosen for their administrative skill, but for their demonstrated personal fealty to Grant. They were his inner circle, his personal bodyguard against the uncertainty of politics. The core anxiety this generates for the American viewer is the ultimate betrayal. The hero failed not out of malice, but out of misplaced trust. The man placed on the pedestal to safeguard the nation's integrity was, through a tragic flaw of character, the one who inadvertently opened the gates to the invaders. The system of patronage, the distribution of government jobs as political rewards, was already endemic, but Grant accelerated it. He didn't see the danger in appointing his wartime associates or the friends of his wife to crucial roles like collector of the port or special supervisor of the Treasury. He saw it as rewarding loyalty. These offices, responsible for collecting the massive new federal revenues, became private fiefdoms handed out like royal titles in a reconstructed kingdom. The most valuable of these fiefdoms were, chillingly, the internal revenue offices in the booming Midwestern cities, places like St. Louis. Here, the flow of cash from the excise tax on liquor was a torrent, a river of gold awaiting an administrator who was loyal to the president, yet utterly disloyal to the law. The stage is set for the rise of John MacDonald, the ultimate parasite who understood the psychological currency of loyalty theater. He knew that to steal from the government, he first had to belong to Grant. He cultivated this friendship with meticulous precision, ensuring the president saw him not as a political operative, but as a devoted comrade in arms. This relationship was not governance. It was emotional manipulation on a national scale. The man the nation trusted most was about to become the unwitting protector of its greatest thieves. The White House was supposed to be the sanctuary of the Republic. Under Grant, it became a castle under siege, not by external enemies, but by the relentless, invisible demands of the Gilded Age. The constant flow of favor seekers, political petitioners, and opportunists created an impenetrable psychic barrier around the general-turned-president. Grant needed a filter, a gatekeeper, a loyal sentinel who would keep the unwanted masses at bay. That sentinel was Orville E. Babcock. Babcock was the ultimate insider, Grant's military aide during the war and now his most trusted personal secretary. He was a man of immense charm, smooth political instincts, and, crucially, total physical proximity to the president. Babcock lived in the White House. He handled Grant's personal mail. He was the one who decided which messages reached the president's desk and which were quietly deflected into the dustbin of history. He was, in a very real sense, the president's mind guard. The psychological function Babcock served for Grant was immense. He provided the familiar, unwavering loyalty of the military structure the president desperately missed. But to the Whiskey Ring, Babcock was the essential master key. His access meant that the vast, complex machine of the federal government could be controlled by a single whispered word, a single misfiled document, or a single suppressed telegram. The documents reveal a new kind of fear. The terrifying simplicity of the conspiracy's defense mechanism. Any investigation into the whiskey ring, any audit, any question, any arrest warrant, had to pass through the Treasury Department, which reported to the president, which meant passing through Babcock. It was a closed, unbreakable loop of authority. John MacDonald, the St. Louis ringleader, understood this dynamic perfectly. His connection was not to the official White House. It was a direct line to Babcock. MacDonald didn't need to corrupt the whole administration. He just needed to control the one man standing between the president and the truth. Their correspondence, always coded and often destroyed, spoke not of illegal taxes but of business matters and political support. This linguistic deception was key. It gave the conspirators the ability to maintain plausible deniability, shifting the conversation from crime to politics whenever questioned. Pause and consider this image. Imagine the medieval court where the king is surrounded by his favored knights and courtiers. Now place Babcock in the role of the king's personal trusted chamberlain, the man who tastes the food and screens the guests. MacDonald, the ring's agent, is always ushered in, his hands bearing gifts and promises, while genuine petitioners, the honest treasury officials trying to warn the president, are barred entry by the chamberlain. The dread escalates as we realize the president himself provided the necessary emotional cover. When whispers of financial misconduct began to circulate, Grant's reaction was consistently one of fierce defensive loyalty. He would not believe that the men he trusted, the men who had proven their mettle in the fire of war, could be common thieves. This inability to suspect treachery was a psychological weakness that the ring exploited ruthlessly. Grant's moral purity, the very quality that made him so appealing to the public, was the primary mechanism of their corruption. The American audience anxiety here is the realization that integrity is not always enough. A powerful yet emotionally isolated hero can be the easiest target for subtle familial betrayal. The ring thrived on the deep, existential fatigue of the nation, using the public's desire for peace as a cover for their internal war against the Treasury. The scale of the theft was staggering. Historians estimate the total loss to the federal government ran into the tens of millions of dollars. Money that should have stabilized the economy, rebuilt the South, and funded veterans' pensions. Instead, it was funding the lavish, opulent lifestyle of the ring members, who mocked the struggling nation with their displays of excess. This was not merely theft. It was a vicious mockery of the sacrifices made during the Civil War. The tragedy of Grant's presidency is this. He sought peace, but his greatest contribution was allowing the rise of a new kind of silent, corporate war against the common citizen. He was the hero who was too trusting, too simple, and too dependent on the wrong kind of loyalty. The very foundation of his power, the unconditional trust of the American people, was being used as the unconditional cover for the largest governmental fraud in history. The stage is now completely set. The general is cloistered, the sentinel is corrupted, the money is flowing. The only thing missing is the man determined to break the code of silence, the man introduced at the end of the previous segment, Benjamin Bristow. The beating heart of the whiskey ring was not in the marble halls of Washington. It was here on the polluted, bustling banks of the Mississippi River, in a place defined by its raw, uncompromising ambition, St. Louis, Missouri. If Washington was the brain of the unfinished nation, St. Louis was its unregulated stomach, churning, consuming, and producing vast quantities of wealth, often through morally dubious means. By the 1870s, this city was the true gateway to the West, a convergence point for railroad lines, river barges, and the immense grain harvests of the Midwest. It was a place where fortunes were made and lost in a single 24-hour cycle. The city's atmosphere was intoxicating, a dizzying blend of the sweet, yeasty smell of fermenting grain, the thick smoke of industrial coal, and the low, constant hum of money changing hands. The psychological profile of St. Louis was one of relentless, aggressive expansion. The war had temporarily interrupted its growth, but post-1865 the city exploded. This rapid, uncontrolled industrialization created a power vacuum where old rules were discarded and new, self-made barons ruled by fiat. It was the perfect environment for a conspiracy. Too fast for the law to catch, too rich for the law to ignore. The documents reveal a new kind of fear, the dread of the unseen bureaucracy. The scale of commerce meant the city's federal offices, the customs house, the post office, and most critically, the Internal Revenue Service, were overwhelmed. They were meant to be bulwarks against fraud, yet they became its most efficient engine. The sheer volume of transactions allowed the ring to hide theft in plain sight. 100 barrels of whiskey missing from the ledger was merely a rounding error in the chaos of St. Louis commerce. St. Louis was specifically critical because it was the epicenter of American whiskey production. The availability of cheap Midwestern grain and access to expansive river transport made it the ideal locale for massive distilleries. These were not the quaint craft operations of earlier decades. These were industrial cathedrals of consumption, enormous structures of brick and iron that processed thousands of bushels of corn daily. The owners of these distilleries were the true masters of the ring, men who had transitioned seamlessly from wartime profiteering to peacetime tax evasion. They were powerful local figures, the city's elite. They hosted lavish parties, funded churches, and made enormous political donations. Their civic virtue was the ultimate pattern interrupt against suspicion. Who would dare question the patriotism or legality of the man who just funded the new city library wing? But here is the detail that truly matters. The relationship between the distillers and the local internal revenue agents was symbiotic, a dangerous codependent marriage. The agents were poorly paid civil servants. The distillers were captains of industry. The social pressure alone was crippling. To investigate a local distiller was to invite social ruin, political isolation, and certain professional destruction. The conspiracy was reinforced not just by bribes, but by peer pressure and social dread. Pause and consider this image. Picture a St. Louis saloon, its atmosphere thick with cigar smoke and the heavy scent of unaged liquor. A revenue agent attempting to conduct a legitimate audit sits alone, his questions deflected by charming but utterly ruthless distillers. Across the room, the local police chief and a city alderman share a quiet, knowing look. The agent is trapped. He is the outsider, the conscience, surrounded by a smiling, unified wall of organized corruption. The city's political machine was utterly subservient to the ring. The Democratic machine was weak, and the Republican machine, loyal to Grant, was entirely captured by the interests of the distillers and their allies. This meant that the men responsible for local law enforcement, judicial appointments, and even the local selection of grand jury members were all indebted to, or directly controlled by, the individuals committing the fraud. Justice itself had been commodified. This created a profound psychological paranoia within the city. Honest businessmen knew what was happening, but they dared not speak. To challenge the ring was to challenge the economic stability of the entire city. The price of integrity was exile. The prevailing atmosphere was one of forced complicit silence, a shared civic dread that kept the engines of corruption running smoothly. The ultimate betrayal was the use of official power as personal weapon. The local U.S. attorney, the federal marshal, and the most critical figure, the supervising special agent of the Treasury, John MacDonald, all held immense governmental authority. But their allegiance was not to the American taxpayer. Their allegiance was to the 35 cents per gallon that flowed into their personal accounts. They were not merely neglecting their duties. They were actively using the power of the federal government to intimidate, silence, and destroy anyone who threatened the flow of illicit cash. St. Louis was the medieval fiefdom of the whiskey ring. The city of temptation found its high priest in John MacDonald, the supervising special agent of the Treasury for St. Louis. MacDonald was not a faceless bureaucrat. He was the archetype of Gilded Age corruption, handsome, ruthlessly charming, and a master manipulator of appearances. He was the perfect con man because he believed completely in the rightness of his own greed. MacDonald understood that in a city built on raw ambition, credibility was the most valuable commodity. He meticulously cultivated his public image as a hero of the Union and, more importantly, a personal friend of President Grant. He ensured that his political contributions were highly publicized and that his loyalty to the Republican machine was unquestionable. This was his armor, a shield of civic righteousness that made him untouchable to local critics. His official title, Supervising Special Agent, gave him direct oversight of the revenue offices and the power to hire, fire, and transfer the very men who audited the distilleries. He had the power of the absolute sovereign within his jurisdiction. He didn't just coordinate the bribes. He structured the entire shadow economy. The operation he engineered, the St. Louis Syndicate, was a masterpiece of organizational crime. MacDonald demanded a flat rate, the aforementioned 35 cents per gallon of untaxed whiskey. This created a sense of corporate predictability for the distillers. They weren't dealing with unpredictable, greedy agents. They were dealing with a single, reliable point of contact who guaranteed them massive profits and, more critically, safety from investigation. But here is the detail that truly matters. The money was channeled through an elaborate network of dummy accounts and fake political fundraising schemes. MacDonald didn't just spend the money. He weaponized it. He used the illicit funds to buy newspapers, control key political conventions, and bankroll the campaigns of judges and city officials. The ring's goal was not merely profit. It was total political dominance over the city, ensuring that the legal system could never touch them. St. Louis became an impenetrable fortress of corruption. This total control fostered a profound sense of moral helplessness among the city's honest citizens and the few clean federal employees remaining. They watched as MacDonald lived a life of staggering opulence, hosting glittering parties that were effectively paid for by the stolen tax money. The psychological impact was corrosive. It taught the public that virtue was a liability and that the only path to success was through collusion. Pause and consider this image. Picture a huge, roaring fire consuming the city's treasury funds. The distillers, MacDonald, and his political allies stand around the fire, warming their hands, their faces lit by the glow of the stolen wealth, while the rest of the city shivers in the cold of poverty and high taxes. This image captures the medieval injustice of the ring, the elite prospering, while the commoner suffers. The link between St. Louis and Washington was maintained by a constant stream of coded communication and personal visits between MacDonald and Orville Babcock. These communications were the umbilical cord sustaining the conspiracy. MacDonald would use his charm and his supposed knowledge of Midwestern politics to secure Babcock's support, often promising lucrative deals or political favors in return for inside information. This relationship ensured that any inquiry launched by honest Treasury officials in Washington would meet a dead end the moment it hit St. Louis. The investigation would be handed off to MacDonald, who would then deliver a fabricated report clearing the distillers, simultaneously labeling the originating Washington official as incompetent or politically motivated. The irony is cruel and complete. The most powerful industrial city in the American heartland was being systematically looted by the very man the President of the United States had personally appointed to protect it. MacDonald's presence in St. Louis provided the conspiracy with the physical infrastructure of theft and the psychological assurance of immunity. The atmosphere in St. Louis was thick with the dread of authority. Every revenue stamp was a lie. Every government document was a fabrication. The men in charge of maintaining order were the architects of chaos. This segment concludes with the realization that the corruption is not an abstract Washington problem. It is a localized, tactical catastrophe that has successfully colonized a major American city, making it ready to withstand any assault. The stage is set for the inevitable confrontation, but the forces of justice must first find a way to break the physical and psychological hold that MacDonald has established over this city of temptation. The greatest conspiracies are not built on violence. They are built on paperwork. They require a complex legal structure that, when viewed through the lens of greed, reveals a fatal exploitable flaw. For the whiskey ring, that flaw was the federal excise tax on distilled spirits. During the Civil War, the government, desperate for funds to fuel the slaughter, had imposed crushing internal taxes. The excise tax on whiskey was one such measure, fluctuating wildly but settling in the 1870s at a staggering 70 cents per gallon. To grasp the gravity of this number, you must understand the sheer scale of the operation. Whiskey was the oil of the 19th century. It was consumed everywhere, fueling not just social habits but the expansion of the frontier and the vast labor force of industrial America. The major distilleries were not small businesses. They were corporate behemoths, processing thousands upon thousands of gallons daily. For them, the 70-cent tax was the single largest cost of doing business, far exceeding the price of the grain or the labor. This cost created the economic mandate for crime. If a distiller could legally produce a gallon for, say, 30 cents and then sell it for $2, the profit margin was clear. But if that distiller could bypass the 70-cent tax, the profit skyrocketed by nearly 300%. The law had inadvertently created a vast, shimmering lake of untaxed cash, demanding only a criminal daring enough to wade in. The system of collection was rudimentary, relying entirely on the honor of the distiller and the sporadic oversight of the local revenue agent. The law dictated that once the whiskey was distilled and ready for shipment, the distiller had to affix a revenue stamp, a small, official piece of paper, to the barrel head signifying the tax had been paid. Without the stamp, the barrel was illicit cargo. This small piece of paper became the psychological linchpin of the entire conspiracy. It was the physical evidence of a lie. The ring's first brilliant move was to corrupt the source of the stamps and the men who affixed them. The revenue agents, the eyes of the Treasury, were often low-paid political appointees. Their loyalty to the government was weak. Their loyalty to a sudden enormous influx of cash was absolute. The distillers didn't just pay them off. They offered them total liberation from their meager, anxious lives. But here is the detail that truly matters. The bribe was not for simply ignoring the law. It was for actively subverting the paperwork. The agents would look away as barrels of untaxed whiskey were hauled out the back door, or more insidiously, they would facilitate the reuse of tax stamps. They would report the legal sale of one barrel, but the stamp for that barrel would be secretly removed and reapplied to 3 or 4 subsequent, untaxed barrels. Pause and consider this image. Picture a dimly lit distillery warehouse in St. Louis. The air is heavy and damp. A revenue agent, handshaking, peels a used tax stamp, the ultimate symbol of federal authority, off a discarded barrel and carefully glues it onto a freshly filled, yet untaxed, cask. That tiny, meticulous act of forgery represented a 7-figure annual theft from the American people. The psychological impact of this system on the distillers was a profound shift from anxious tax avoidance to entitled criminality. They were no longer merely dodging a fee. They were actively partners in defrauding the nation's treasury, protected by the very agents meant to police them. The 70 cents per gallon became the official toll for the public, while the 35 cents they paid to John MacDonald and his crew became the private tribute to the Whiskey King. The public, weary and focused on Reconstruction, had no knowledge of this technical betrayal. They saw the price of liquor, they saw the official stamp, and they assumed legality. This trust, this willful ignorance, was the conspiracy's most vital asset. The fraud was engineered to be invisible to the common eye, hidden deep within the ledgers and the repetitive mechanics of the industrial process. The documents reveal a new kind of fear, the terrifying realization that the simplicity of the fraud was its greatest defense. It required no complicated codes or elaborate subterfuge, only the corruption of a few key low-level officials and the massive, industrial scale of the distillery operations to bury the evidence under a mountain of inventory. The taxman's loophole was not a flaw in the law itself. It was a flaw in human vigilance, a dark reflection of the nation's desperate need to look away from its own administrative chaos. The easy money had become a corrosive poison, rapidly infecting the body politic from the banks of the Mississippi all the way to the president's personal staff. The loophole was open, but to maximize the plunder, the flow had to be predictable and systematic. The brilliance of the ring lay in transforming decentralized petty fraud into an organized, centralized operation. A criminal corporation run with medieval efficiency and ruthless modern accounting. John MacDonald, the kingpin in St. Louis, formalized the theft through the syndicate. He created a tariff of corruption. Every distiller was required to pay him a set fee per untaxed gallon, usually 35 cents. This structure served two critical psychological functions. First, it eliminated competition. All ring members were stealing at the same rate, guaranteeing massive profits without fear of being undercut by a cheaper criminal rival. Second, it ensured loyalty to MacDonald, as he guaranteed them absolute protection from the very government they were robbing. The payout system was a masterpiece of coded paranoia. The immense amounts of cash collected by MacDonald could not simply be deposited in a bank. Instead, it was laundered through elaborate, non-official channels, often disguised as political contributions or subscription funds for the Republican Party. This served the dual purpose of hiding the cash while simultaneously strengthening the political machine that protected them. The documents reveal a new kind of fear, the terrifying realization that the simplicity of the fraud was its greatest defense. It required no complicated codes or elaborate subterfuge, only the corruption of a few key low-level officials and the massive, industrial scale of the distillery operations to bury the evidence under a mountain of inventory. The taxman's loophole was not a flaw in the law itself. It was a flaw in human vigilance, a dark reflection of the nation's desperate need to look away from its own administrative chaos. The easy money had become a corrosive poison, rapidly infecting the body politic from the banks of the Mississippi all the way to the president's personal staff. The loophole was open, but to maximize the plunder, the flow had to be predictable and systematic. The brilliance of the ring lay in transforming decentralized petty fraud into an organized, centralized operation. a criminal corporation run with medieval efficiency and ruthless modern accounting. John McDonald, the kingpin in St. Louis, formalized the theft through the syndicate. He created a tariff of corruption. Every distiller was required to pay him a set fee per untaxed gallon, usually 35 cents. This structure served two critical psychological functions. First, it eliminated competition. All ring members were stealing at the same rate, guaranteeing massive profits without fear of being undercut by a cheaper criminal rival. Second, it ensured loyalty to McDonald, as he guaranteed them absolute protection from the very government they were robbing. The payout system was a masterpiece of coded paranoia. The immense amounts of cash collected by McDonald could not simply be deposited in a bank. Instead, it was laundered through elaborate non-official channels, often disguised as political contributions or subscription funds for the Republican Party. This served the dual purpose of hiding the cash while simultaneously strengthening the political machine that protected them. The documents reveal a new kind of fear. The terrifying realization that the simplicity of the fraud was its greatest defense. It required no complicated codes or elaborate subterfuge, only the corruption of a few key low-level officials and the massive, industrial scale of the distillery operations to bury the evidence under a mountain of inventory. The taxman's loophole was not a flaw in the law itself. It was a flaw in human vigilance, a dark reflection of the nation's desperate need to look away from its own administrative chaos. The easy money had become a corrosive poison, rapidly infecting the body politic from the banks of the Mississippi all the way to the president's personal staff. The loophole was open, but to maximize the plunder, the flow had to be predictable and systematic. The brilliance of the ring lay in transforming decentralized petty fraud into an organized, centralized operation, a criminal corporation run with medieval efficiency and ruthless modern accounting. John McDonald, the kingpin in St. Louis, formalized the theft through the syndicate. He created a tariff of corruption. Every distiller was required to pay him a set fee per untaxed gallon, usually 35 cents. This structure served two critical psychological functions. First, it eliminated competition. All ring members were stealing at the same rate, guaranteeing massive profits without fear of being undercut by a cheaper criminal rival. Second, it ensured loyalty to McDonald, as he guaranteed them absolute protection from the very government they were robbing. The payout system was a masterpiece of coded paranoia. The immense amounts of cash collected by McDonald could not simply be deposited in a bank. Instead, it was laundered through elaborate non-official channels, often disguised as political contributions or subscription funds for the Republican Party. This served the dual purpose of hiding the cash while simultaneously strengthening the political machine that protected them. The ultimate destination of this stolen 70 cents was the American political system itself. A significant portion of the cash flowed directly to Washington, delivered to political operatives and, critically, into the hands of Orville E. Babcock, President Grant's personal secretary. Babcock served as the banker and courier for the D.C. end of the operation, ensuring that the ring had a direct, fungible connection to the executive branch. But here is the detail that truly matters. The payment to Babcock was not just a bribe for services rendered. It was an insurance premium paid to the highest power in the land. It bought the whiskey ring the ultimate psychological safety. The assurance that the entire federal enforcement structure would stall the moment it approached the White House gates. They were protected by the aura of presidential authority. Pause and consider this image. Imagine the National Treasury Building, a vast, complex machine, designed to intake the wealth of the nation. Now see the whiskey ring as a single, perfectly inserted mechanical lever that diverts a huge, silent stream of that wealth straight from the collection point, the excise tax, into the pockets of a few well-connected men. The machine is running, the people are paying, but the destination of the money has been subtly, tragically altered. The scale of the theft, enabled by this loophole in organizational genius, was so vast that it became a major factor in the national budget deficit. The stolen revenue meant less money for vital federal programs, less money to stabilize the post-war economy, and less money to support the veterans who had bled for the Union. The easy money for the ring meant hardship and betrayal for the American taxpayer. This system, built on the mundane structure of tax law, had achieved what the Confederate armies could not. It had fundamentally undermined the financial and moral integrity of the United States government. The loophole was the weapon, and Grant's misplaced loyalty was the shield. The paranoia is now fully established. The American citizen is paying a tax not to fund the Republic, but to enrich the very men entrusted with its administration. Every great conspiracy is defined not by its scale, but by the psychological architecture of the men who build it. The whiskey ring was a machine, yes, but its gears were turned by ambition, entitlement, and the absolute certainty that they were untouchable. To understand the depth of the betrayal, we must examine the unholy trinity at the center of the storm. The distiller, the politician, and the president's man, the base of the triangle. The source of the stolen gold was the distiller. These were the corporate titans of the Gilded Age, men like J.I. Henderson and R.V. Kennedy, local royalty who operated the industrial cathedrals in St. Louis and Chicago. Their anxiety was purely financial. The 70-cent excise tax threatened their colossal profit margins. They were not criminals seeking chaos. They were businessmen seeking monopoly. Their psychology was defined by corporate greed masquerading as political necessity. They viewed the federal tax not as a civic duty, but as a bureaucratic obstacle to their manifest destiny of wealth. They understood that the most efficient way to maximize profit was not through innovation, but through corruption. This moral simplification, the idea that it was easier to buy the law than to follow it, was the psychological fuel of the entire conspiracy. They brought the money and the industrial scale. They provided the river of untaxed liquor. But here's the detail that truly matters. The distillers rarely dealt directly with Washington. They insulated themselves, using their immense local influence and wealth as a primary shield. They needed a purveyor of protection, a figure who could bridge the gap between the smoky warehouses of St. Louis and the hushed corridors of federal power. That figure was John McDonald. McDonald, the supervising special agent of the Treasury in St. Louis, was the quintessential politician in this dark drama. He was the architect of the syndicate, the man who codified the chaos of individual bribes into a scalable corporate structure of theft. His background was telling: a wounded war veteran, a man who possessed charm and ambition in equal measure, but whose loyalty ran only as deep as his self-interest. McDonald's genius was psychological. He didn't demand loyalty, he enforced dependency. By centralizing the collection of the illegal 35 cents per gallon, he made every distiller in the region rely entirely on his protection. If they tried to leave the syndicate, he could unleash the full force of the very government he controlled. Audits, closures, ruin. He bound them with a shared, terrifying secret, creating an atmosphere of mutual dread that guaranteed silence. The documents reveal a new kind of fear, the knowledge that the man appointed to safeguard the taxes was the one who enforced the theft. McDonald used his official Treasury title not as a symbol of duty, but as a medieval letter of marque, authorizing piracy on the high seas of the American economy. He used government stationery, government offices, and government authority to run his criminal empire. This deep subversion is what resonated with the American fear of government betrayal. The uniform of the state was merely the costume of the thief. Pause and consider this image. Picture McDonald in his official St. Louis office, the American flag hanging behind his desk. He smiles, a picture of civic virtue, while across the desk, a nervous distiller hands him a satchel filled with cash stolen from the U.S. Treasury. The psychological tension is in the visual paradox. The crime is being conducted within the physical sanctuary of the law. McDonald's ambition, however, had an upper limit, St. Louis. To protect his multi-million-dollar operation, he needed a voice in the king's court, a direct conduit to the power of President Grant. He needed a guarantee that when the whispers of scandal reached Washington, they would not merely be delayed but annihilated. He needed the third and most dangerous player. This is where the story pivots from organized crime to high treason, the final vertex of the triangle. The critical link that guaranteed the ring's immunity was Orville E. Babcock. He was the president's man. Orville E. Babcock was not a distiller and, unlike McDonald, he was not a career Treasury official. He was the most intimate layer of defense surrounding the President of the United States. His role as Grant's private secretary was defined by total access and unwavering trust. He lived in the White House, handled all correspondence, and essentially functioned as the filter through which all outside information and all outside money passed. Before reaching the weary General Babcock's psychology was built on the arrogance of unquestioned proximity. He was acutely aware that his power derived entirely from his physical presence next to the nation's most powerful man. He did not need to be competent or ethical. He only needed to be loyal, at least loyal to Grant, even if it meant betraying the nation. For the whiskey ring, Babcock was the essential Washington node. He was their insurance policy against ruin, their political shield against investigation. McDonald didn't buy Babcock's silence. He bought his active intervention. Babcock's price was not just high, it was the ultimate political currency, the security of the presidency itself. Their relationship was cemented by frequent coded communication. When Bristow's honest Treasury agents began to sniff around the St. Louis operation, McDonald would immediately send a cryptic telegram to Babcock. Babcock's response, often veiled as a personal or political message, would confirm that the investigation was known and would soon be neutralized. This communication chain, from the filthy profits of the St. Louis warehouses to the delicate china of the White House dining room, was the circulatory system of the conspiracy. But here is the detail that truly matters. Babcock's function was not merely intercepting inquiries, it was providing plausible deniability to President Grant. If an honest official tried to alert Grant directly to McDonald's crimes, Babcock could step in and frame the accusation as a political attack against Grant's friends. A partisan smear designed to undermine the administration. Grant's tragic flaw of misplaced loyalty ensured that he would always choose the word of his trusted aide over the evidence of a suspicious outsider. Pause and consider this image. Picture the White House at night. Grant is asleep. Babcock is awake, alone in his office, reading a coded telegram that details the next phase of the tax fraud. He is surrounded by the highest symbols of American democracy, the documents of state, the Constitution, yet he is quietly, efficiently running a criminal enterprise from the heart of the Republic. This is the ultimate betrayal, the destruction wrought not by enemies but by the trusted Chamberlain. The blending of whiskey in Washington was complete. The distillers provided the cash flow, MacDonald provided the criminal organization. Babcock provided the political immunity. They operated as a single, flawless entity, protected by the very structure of the government they were robbing. The American taxpayer, already exhausted by the anxieties of Reconstruction, was caught in the middle, funding the corruption with every penny of the excise tax. The psychological consequence of this betrayal was devastating. It taught the nation that power was not a responsibility, but an opportunity for theft. It planted the seed of deep, enduring paranoia that the men who stand highest in the government are often the ones most actively working against the interests of the common citizen. The high hopes of Reconstruction had been completely crushed by the weight of corporate greed, facilitated by the hero of the Civil War's tragic blind spot. The ring's key players felt invincible. They had corrupted the system from the factory floor to the president's desk. They believed their conspiracy was too high, too complex, and too politically charged for any single honest man to touch. But that belief, that arrogance of untouchability, was the single greatest weakness Bristow would soon exploit. The next move required dismantling this trinity of corruption, starting with the very heart of the operation. The greatest flaw in the armor of the state is trust. The whiskey ring did not rely on brute force. It relied on the absolute erosion of fiduciary duty, replacing the oath of office with the solemn, silent agreement of the invisible handshake. This handshake was the core ritual of the conspiracy, binding distiller to agent and agent to the White House. The transfer of money, the bribes and kickbacks, was not a casual exchange. It was a highly ritualized transaction designed to minimize paper trails and maximize psychological control. In St. Louis, the cash was collected by John MacDonald not in haphazard piles, but according to a standardized criminal tariff, 35 cents per gallon of untaxed whiskey. This massive flowing stream of illicit gold required sophisticated laundering. The money was disguised as political contributions, often referred to as campaign funds or subscriptions. This was the first layer of psychological protection. By associating the stolen funds with the necessary expenses of the ruling political party, the conspirators created a powerful, plausible deniability. If questioned, the transfer was not a bribe but a civic donation. The recipient was not a criminal. He was a political operative keeping the party alive. But here is the detail that truly matters. The actual transfer of funds was often handled by a select group of trusted, low-level couriers, men who were kept ignorant of the money's true destination. This compartmentalization was key. The courier knew he carried a large sum of cash, but he did not know it was stolen tax revenue. Nor did he know who its ultimate recipient would be in Washington. This technique minimized the risk of exposure, ensuring that if one piece of the chain broke, the entire system would not collapse. The courier was a blind messenger delivering the wages of sin. The method of transport was designed for maximum visual deception. The money, often large wads of newly printed currency, was not shipped in obvious safes. Instead, it was concealed in the banal containers of everyday life, tucked inside packages of routine documents, wrapped in copies of official government reports, or even hidden within boxes of high-end cigars meant as gifts for Washington officials. The crime was literally hidden within the appearance of legitimate commerce and governance. Pause and consider this image. Picture a well-dressed man stepping off the train in Washington, D.C., carrying a simple leather briefcase containing what appears to be a batch of routine Treasury reports. But hidden beneath the official paper are stacks of currency, thousands of dollars stolen directly from the American taxpayer. The invisibility of the crime is chilling. It moved openly, protected by the very mediocrity of its disguise. The kickbacks were the internal mechanism of control. MacDonald did not pay his subordinates, the revenue agents who failed to check the stamps, a fixed salary. He paid them a percentage of the take. This was a brilliant psychological move. It bound the agents' self-interest directly to the success of the fraud. Their personal prosperity was entirely contingent on the continued theft. They were not just corrupt, they were invested in the conspiracy. This created a profound state of shared psychological entrapment. The emotional escalation was driven by the knowledge that the money demanded escalating risks. As the conspiracy grew, MacDonald's demands grew larger, requiring the agents to falsify more ledgers, apply more reused stamps, and ignore greater volumes of untaxed liquor. The initial small bribe quickly became a lifelong debt of guilt that could only be paid through deeper and deeper immersion into the crime. The documents reveal a new kind of fear, the power of coded language. To communicate across the distances between St. Louis, Chicago, and Washington, the conspirators could not use plain text. They relied on specific code words and phrases that transformed criminal instruction into political gossip. Telegrams would inquire about arrangements for the coming election when they were actually discussing the next shipment of untaxed whiskey. They talked of subscriptions when they meant bribes, and mustard or sweeteners when referring to the money itself. This linguistic betrayal meant that even if an honest operator intercepted their messages, the communication would appear routine, a political discussion, a business inquiry. The true meaning was hidden in plain sight, accessible only to those who had submitted to the invisible handshake. The language of the Republic had been colonized by thieves. The intricate system of kickbacks and coded messages was designed for one final, devastating goal: to buy political immunity at the highest level. The destination of the largest, most crucial payments was always the same: the personal office of Orville E. Babcock, President Grant's most trusted secretary. Babcock's role was not merely to accept the kickbacks. It was to utilize the code words to trigger the suppression of federal inquiries. When MacDonald sent a coded telegram warning of a rising suspicion, Babcock had a specific chilling protocol. He would use his absolute access to the President and the Treasury Secretary's offices to ensure that the investigation was either misdirected, stalled, or outright killed. This required the ultimate psychological performance. Babcock had to maintain the perfect facade of loyalty and professionalism, even while he was acting as the chief political operative for a national criminal enterprise. He operated in the constant, high-stakes atmosphere of the White House, where every word was noted and every action scrutinized. His ability to perform this high-wire act for years cemented his reputation as the most dangerous and arrogant player in the ring. But here is the detail that truly matters. Babcock often leveraged the president's own words as part of the code. If Grant, in a moment of naive honesty, stated his desire for clean government, Babcock would use that instruction as cover to dismiss an honest official who was actually getting too close to the truth. The president's own good intentions were weaponized against the American people. The invisible handshake reached its most potent form in the judicial and prosecutorial appointments. The money stolen from the excise tax was used to ensure that the U.S. attorneys and federal judges in key cities like St. Louis and Chicago were men who were either directly complicit or politically obligated to the ring. This created a medieval scenario where the law was rendered powerless by its own custodians. When a rare, honest prosecutor attempted to bring charges, the grand jury, often stacked with ring sympathizers, would refuse to indict. Justice was not just blind. It was bought and gagged. The psychological consequence for the few honest men in the Treasury Department, like the coming hero Benjamin Bristow, was paralyzing. They were fighting an enemy that used the very tools of their trade, telegrams, ledgers, and courtrooms against them. Their fear was that no matter how solid their evidence, the invisible handshake would always reach higher, further, and deeper into power than they could ever hope to climb. They were facing an enemy that wore the uniform of the state and spoke in the code words of friendship. This level of systemic, institutional betrayal generates the deepest anxieties in the American psyche, the horrifying truth that the system is a lie. The tax you pay is funding the corruption. The official you trust is the thief. The hope of reconstruction has been extinguished by a cold, calculating criminal network that perfected the art of administrative invisibility. The ring had woven a perfect web of financial kickbacks, coded communication, and political protection, binding the operation from the distillery floor to the executive mansion. They had achieved absolute psychological immunity. But the very sophistication of their system, the immense network of messengers, secret meetings, and paper trails, left tiny physical traces. These were the only clues a determined man could follow. The ultimate vulnerability lay not in the corruption of the men, but in the immutability of arithmetic and the physical reality of the stolen funds. The dark heart of the whiskey ring was a single, devastating psychological truth. Proximity to power is the ultimate weapon. The mastermind of the St. Louis operation was a man who understood this principle better than any other Gilded Age criminal, John MacDonald. MacDonald was not merely corrupt. He was the paragon of engineered betrayal. His official title, Supervising Special Agent of the Treasury, granted him sweeping federal authority in the most critical revenue-generating region of the nation. But his true power stemmed from something far more valuable than a title, a careful, meticulously crafted public image as the personal friend of President Ulysses S. Grant. He was a hero of the Union, a charming personality, and a ruthless political operator. MacDonald understood that in the chaos of the post-war era, the only currency that truly mattered was trust. He used his war record and his alleged intimacy with the president as a political amulet, warding off any official suspicion. To question MacDonald was, in the public mind, to cast doubt on Grant himself. The psychological foundation of the St. Louis Syndicate lay in this carefully manufactured untouchability. MacDonald didn't need to fear the law, because the moment he received his presidential appointment, he became the law in St. Louis. He was the sovereign authority tasked with collecting the very revenue he intended to steal. But here is the detail that truly matters. MacDonald did not invent the local corruption. He centralized and professionalized it. He gathered the city's largest distillers and presented them with a choice that was no choice at all. Join his syndicate, pay the tribute and receive total immunity, or operate legally, face crushing competition, and be targeted by the very revenue agents he controlled. This created a criminal cartel enforced by the power of the state. The syndicate was a masterpiece of organizational crime, structured like a medieval guild of thieves. MacDonald enforced strict discipline. Every distiller had to pay the exact codified amount, 35 cents per gallon of untaxed liquor. This standardized kickback was the glue that held the ring together. It eliminated price wars among the conspirators and guaranteed the loyalty of the Treasury officials beneath MacDonald, who all received their cut from the syndicate's centralized treasury. Pause and consider this image. Picture MacDonald's office in the St. Louis Customs House. It is a place of official authority, but it functions as the counting house of a criminal empire. Distillers queue silently, not to pay the government, but to pay him. He is the unofficial taxman of the Midwest, collecting tribute in the name of the president he claims to serve. This structure bred a pervasive atmosphere of paranoia and complicity. Every revenue agent who accepted a bribe became a vassal in McDonald's fiefdom, bound by a shared life-ruining secret. McDonald's true genius lay not in the stealing, but in the psychological entrapment of his associates. He knew that the fear of mutual destruction was a far stronger bond than any oath of loyalty. The stolen revenue was immense, a staggering financial hemorrhage for the nation. McDonald used his share not merely for personal enrichment, though he certainly lived with spectacular vulgar opulence. More importantly, he used the money to buy political dominion. He became the chief financier of the Republican machine in Missouri, ensuring that every judge, every prosecutor, and every customs official owed their position not to merit, but to the syndicate's stolen cash. The documents reveal a new kind of fear, the deep-seated historical anxiety that political power is for sale. McDonald did not just steal money. He stole the integrity of the democratic process in St. Louis. He created an impenetrable barrier of bought officials, ensuring that when the inevitable official inquiry arrived, it would be met by silence, bureaucratic obstruction, and judges who were already on the payroll. The St. Louis Syndicate was the physical manifestation of the taxman's loophole, transforming abstract corruption into a high-functioning localized crime machine. But McDonald knew that even his dominance over the Midwest was fragile without an anchor in the storm center, the White House. He needed his power to be echoed, confirmed, and protected by the very highest authority. This necessity drove him into a direct, dangerous alliance with the president's personal sentinel. McDonald's ascension from regional boss to national threat required the final, fatal ingredient, the White House connection. He was a master of social engineering, meticulously cultivating his image as Grant's devoted friend. This was his political medieval armor, polished with expensive gifts, lavish entertainment, and, most effectively, unwavering flattery. He understood Grant's psychological needs. The president craved simple, uncomplicated loyalty in the face of Washington's political sniping. McDonald played this role perfectly, presenting himself as a straightforward man of action, a fellow veteran who supported Grant unconditionally. This manufactured kinship provided McDonald with the ultimate shield, the president's blind, defensive trust. The actual link to the executive mansion, however, ran through Orville E. Babcock. McDonald's relationship with Babcock was transactional, rooted entirely in the flow of untaxed cash. McDonald provided the money and the political resources. Babcock provided the immunity. Their communications were frequent and highly sensitive, often involving coded telegrams that disguised criminal updates as routine political strategy. McDonald's messages to Babcock detailed elections and deliveries when they meant the transfer of illicit funds and the status of threatened investigations. This required a constant high-stakes performance from both men, operating in the perpetual shadow of exposure. But here is the detail that truly matters. McDonald occasionally traveled to Washington and stayed at the White House, not as a paid official but as a personal guest of Babcock. Imagine the psychological audacity. The man supervising the nation's largest tax fraud was sleeping under the roof of the president, dining at his table, and sharing small talk with the first family. This proximity was the ultimate deterrent to any investigator. It was the physical proof of McDonald's invincibility. Pause and consider this image. Picture McDonald, warm and jovial, chatting with Grant about the war in the executive office. Meanwhile, a confidential Treasury report detailing the suspicious revenue shortfall sits unread on a nearby desk, placed there by a clean official who hoped to alert the president. McDonald's presence ensures the report will never be opened, killed by the silent power of a handshake and a smile. MacDonald ensured the syndicate's absolute protection by constantly reminding his subordinates of his access. He deliberately exaggerated his intimacy with Grant, reinforcing the chain of dread that ran from the White House down to the newest revenue agent. He created an environment where officials feared him far more than they feared the consequences of breaking the federal law. Their personal survival depended entirely on the continued success of the conspiracy. The money MacDonald stole was, in the end, used to perpetuate the lie of Reconstruction. It funded the political campaigns that promised stability and integrity, while simultaneously undermining the very foundations of the state. The ultimate betrayal was that the vast wealth generated by the whiskey ring bought the silence of judges, the compliance of agents, and, most tragically, the blindness of the hero who promised the nation peace. John MacDonald, the president's man in St. Louis, was not merely a thief. He was the symbol of the Gilded Age's profound psychological corruption. A man who weaponized trust and turned the simple act of governance into a highly profitable criminal enterprise. The syndicate he built was an impenetrable fortress, protected by the emotional failings of the most powerful man in America. The corruption was complete. The system was sealed. The only remaining question was how an honest man, the coming reformer Benjamin Bristow, could possibly breach this fortress. He could not fight MacDonald in St. Louis, where the judges were bought. He could not appeal to Grant, whose ears were guarded by Babcock. To break the syndicate, Bristow would have to find a way to strike at the physical evidence, the Achilles heel of any financial conspiracy, without alerting the president's man. The time for silent investigation was ending. The time for decisive, shocking action was about to begin. The corrupt system of the whiskey ring, sealed by the invisible handshake of John MacDonald and Orville Babcock, was an impenetrable fortress. It was protected by the arrogance of high office and shielded by President Grant's naive loyalty. But every fortress has a flaw, and every age of darkness gives rise to an unlikely champion. In the year 1874, that champion arrived not on a war horse but in a quiet, unassuming office within the Treasury Department. His name was Benjamin Helm Bristow. Bristow was an anomaly in Washington, a man of severe, almost puritanical rectitude, utterly devoid of the Gilded Age's lust for quick profit or political spectacle. He was a Kentuckian, a committed Unionist who had fought honorably, yet his ambition was not power but order. Grant appointed him Secretary of the Treasury, hoping for a clean administrator who could simply stabilize the department after a series of minor embarrassments. Grant got more than he bargained for. He got a relentless force of nature disguised as a bookkeeper. Bristow walked into a Treasury Department saturated with the smell of old paper and fresh lies. The atmosphere was a low-grade psychological poison. Inefficiency was assumed and corruption was the unspoken rule. His first act was not to rage but to calculate. He began a quiet, methodical audit of the nation's revenue collections, comparing the expected yield from major industrial centers, especially St. Louis, against the reported intake. The numbers did not match. They were not merely wrong. They were aggressively wrong. The data revealed a systematic, inexplicable shortfall in the excise tax collections on distilled spirits, a financial hemorrhage that suggested millions of dollars were vanishing annually. Bristow, a man whose mind operated on logic and arithmetic, realized that he was not facing incompetence. He was facing a strategic, organized theft. The documents reveal a new kind of fear, the fear of arithmetic. The ring had corrupted men, judges, and telegrams, but they could not corrupt the immutable laws of mathematics. The scale of the whiskey being produced, measured by grain consumption and industrial capacity, was vastly greater than the scale of the tax stamps being legally reported. The theft was hiding in the sheer size of the lie. Bristow understood instantly that to fight this corruption through the proper channels would be suicide. Any formal inquiry would travel up the Treasury chain, across the desk of Babcock and straight to John MacDonald in St. Louis. The investigation would be dead before the ink dried on the first memo. He was surrounded by enemy agents loyal to the syndicate, not the state. Pause and consider this image. Picture Bristow alone in his Treasury office late at night. The gaslight casts long dancing shadows. He is hunched over a vast, intimidating ledger, the columns of numbers spelling out the financial ruin of the Republic. The office feels less like a government post and more like a besieged library where the last honest scholar is frantically decoding the enemy's plans. His decision was daring, bordering on insubordination. He would create a secret government within the government. He bypassed the entire official hierarchy and assembled a small hand-picked team of untraceable agents. These men were chosen not for their political connections, but for their anonymity, their professional competence, and their absolute moral integrity. They were Bristow's silent cavaliers, tasked with a mission of covert espionage against the very administration they ostensibly served. This shadow operation was the ultimate pattern interrupt against the ring's established control. Bristow gave his agents specific instructions. Ignore the official ledgers. Ignore the agents on the ground. Instead, focus on the physical reality of the fraud. Track the grain shipments. Count the barrels leaving the distilleries by night. Follow the flow of untaxed product and the coded messages of the syndicate's couriers. This meticulous ground-level investigation was an act of pure psychological warfare. The ring operated on the assumption that corruption started and ended with paper. Bristow was attacking the conspiracy where it was most vulnerable, the physical evidence of logistics. The tension mounted with every passing week, as Bristow received cryptic reports from his secret agents, all confirming the horrifying scale of the syndicate's organized crime. The evidence was building stone by agonizing stone, and the reformer was preparing to move from calculation to confrontation. The covert investigation, Bristow's secret war, was a grueling campaign of psychological endurance. His agents lived under constant threat of exposure, knowing that if John MacDonald or Orville Babcock discovered their existence, their careers and potentially their lives would be forfeit. They were hunting men who were, by all outward appearances, highly respected officials and businessmen. The critical breakthrough arrived not through a confession, but through the physical manifestation of the code. Bristow's agents, focused on tracking the physical flow of goods, discovered a reliable pattern in the shipments of certain chemical supplies and equipment, supplies used to remove and reuse the tax stamps. This meticulous tracking of the tools of the crime, rather than the money itself, provided irrefutable, untraceable evidence of systemic stamp fraud across multiple major cities. This hard evidence confirmed the necessary truth. The conspiracy was national, orchestrated by the syndicate and protected from Washington. Bristow now faced the ultimate political hurdle. He had the proof, but he did not have the authority to strike without passing through the very man he knew was compromised. He had to convince President Grant to unleash the full force of the federal government on Grant's own friends. But here is the detail that truly matters. Bristow employed a strategy of psychological isolation. He understood Grant's fierce yet simple moral code. He knew that the president saw himself as an honest man betrayed by others. Bristow requested a private, unscheduled meeting with Grant, ensuring that Orville Babcock, the Sentinel, could not intercede or prime the president beforehand. This was a direct, high-stakes political ambush. In that meeting, Bristow did not offer opinions or accusations. He presented incontrovertible arithmetic and the physical evidence gathered by his secret agents. He detailed the tax shortfalls, the reused stamps, and the undeniable patterns of organized theft. He framed the case not as a political squabble, but as a direct insult to Grant's honor and a betrayal of the Union soldiers whose pensions the stolen money was meant to fund. Bristow gave Grant no space for political maneuvering, forcing him to choose between the lie of loyalty and the truth of the ledger. Pause and consider this image. Picture the moment of confrontation in the White House. Bristow, severe and calm, lays out the evidence, the ledgers, the coded messages, the agent reports. Grant, the great general, looks physically stunned, confronted by a conspiracy more insidious than any Confederate force. The room is silent, heavy with the weight of impending decision. Under this intense, focused pressure, Grant cracked. His military instincts, the demand for swift, decisive action against an enemy, took over. He issued the instruction that would become the mantra of the investigation, though tragically, he would later compromise it. Let no guilty man escape. Bristow secured the critical authorization, the power to strike without warning, bypassing all local officials and even the Attorney General, who was suspected of being too friendly with the ring. This was a medieval decree of absolute authority, placing the execution of justice entirely in the hands of the reformer. The psychological toll on Bristow was immense. He was now operating under a ticking clock, knowing that any slip, any leak would destroy him, discredit the president, and allow the conspirators to escape. He had to move with speed, secrecy, and overwhelming force. He decided on a course of action that was unprecedented in American history. A coordinated, simultaneous federal raid across multiple major cities, striking at the heart of the syndicate's network. This decision marked the true beginning of the war against the whiskey ring. Bristow, the quiet accountant, had transformed himself into the silent executioner, preparing to unleash a shockwave that would expose the rotten core of the Gilded Age to the terrified gaze of the American public. The fear was no longer about the crime itself, but the inevitability of exposure. John McDonald, the president's man in St. Louis, was not merely a thief. He was the symbol of the Gilded Age's profound psychological corruption. A man who weaponized trust and turned the simple act of governance into a highly profitable criminal enterprise. The syndicate he built was an impenetrable fortress, protected by the emotional failings of the most powerful man in America. The corruption was complete. The system was sealed. The only remaining question was how an honest man, the coming reformer Benjamin Bristow, could possibly breach this fortress. He could not fight McDonald in St. Louis, where the judges were bought. He could not appeal to Grant, whose ears were guarded by Babcock. To break the syndicate, Bristow would have to find a way to strike at the physical evidence, the Achilles heel of any financial conspiracy, without alerting the president's man. The time for silent investigation was ending. The time for decisive, shocking action was about to begin. The corrupt system of the whiskey ring, sealed by the invisible handshake of John McDonald and Orville Babcock, was an impenetrable fortress. It was protected by the arrogance of high office and shielded by President Grant's naive loyalty. But every fortress has a flaw, and every age of darkness gives rise to an unlikely champion. In the year 1874, that champion arrived not on a war horse but in a quiet, unassuming office within the Treasury Department. His name was Benjamin Helm Bristow. Bristow was an anomaly in Washington, a man of severe, almost puritanical rectitude, utterly devoid of the Gilded Age's lust for quick profit or political spectacle. He was a Kentuckian, a committed Unionist who had fought honorably, yet his ambition was not power but order. Grant appointed him Secretary of the Treasury, hoping for a clean administrator who could simply stabilize the department after a series of minor embarrassments. Grant got more than he bargained for. He got a relentless force of nature disguised as a bookkeeper. Bristow walked into a Treasury department saturated with the smell of old paper and fresh lies. The atmosphere was a low-grade psychological poison. Inefficiency was assumed and corruption was the unspoken rule. His first act was not to rage but to calculate. He began a quiet, methodical audit of the nation's revenue collections, comparing the expected yield from major industrial centers, especially St. Louis, against the reported intake. The numbers did not match. They were not merely wrong. They were aggressively wrong. The data revealed a systematic, inexplicable shortfall in the excise tax collections on distilled spirits, a financial hemorrhage that suggested millions of dollars were vanishing annually. Bristow, a man whose mind operated on logic and arithmetic, realized that he was not facing incompetence. He was facing a strategic, organized theft. The documents reveal a new kind of fear, the fear of arithmetic. The ring had corrupted men, judges, and telegrams, but they could not corrupt the immutable laws of mathematics. The scale of the whiskey being produced, measured by grain consumption and industrial capacity, was vastly greater than the scale of the tax stamps being legally reported. The theft was hiding in the sheer size of the lie. Bristow understood instantly that to fight this corruption through the proper channels would be suicide. Any formal inquiry would travel up the Treasury chain, across the desk of Babcock and straight to John McDonald in St. Louis. The investigation would be dead before the ink dried on the first memo. He was surrounded by enemy agents loyal to the syndicate, not the state. Pause and consider this image. Picture Bristow alone in his Treasury office late at night. The gaslight casts long dancing shadows. He is hunched over a vast, intimidating ledger, the columns of numbers spelling out the financial ruin of the Republic. The office feels less like a government post and more like a besieged library where the last honest scholar is frantically decoding the enemy's plans. His decision was daring, bordering on insubordination. He would create a secret government within the government. He bypassed the entire official hierarchy and assembled a small, hand-picked team of untraceable agents. These men were chosen not for their political connections, but for their anonymity, their professional competence, and their absolute moral integrity. They were Bristow's silent cavaliers, tasked with a mission of covert espionage against the very administration they ostensibly served. This shadow operation was the ultimate pattern interrupt against the ring's established control. Bristow gave his agents specific instructions. Ignore the official ledgers. Ignore the agents on the ground. Instead, focus on the physical reality of the fraud. Track the grain shipments. Count the barrels leaving the distilleries by night. Follow the flow of untaxed product and the coded messages of the syndicate's couriers. This meticulous ground-level investigation was an act of pure psychological warfare. The ring operated on the assumption that corruption started and ended with paper. Bristow was attacking the conspiracy where it was most vulnerable, the physical evidence of logistics. The tension mounted with every passing week, as Bristow received cryptic reports from his secret agents, all confirming the horrifying scale of the syndicate's organized crime. The evidence was building stone by agonizing stone, and the reformer was preparing to move from calculation to confrontation. The covert investigation, Bristow's secret war, was a grueling campaign of psychological endurance. His agents lived under constant threat of exposure, knowing that if John McDonald or Orville Babcock discovered their existence, their careers and potentially their lives would be forfeit. They were hunting men who were, by all outward appearances, highly respected officials and businessmen. The critical breakthrough arrived not through a confession, but through the physical manifestation of the code. Bristow's agents, focused on tracking the physical flow of goods, discovered a reliable pattern in the shipments of certain chemical supplies and equipment, supplies used to remove and reuse the tax stamps. This meticulous tracking of the tools of the crime, rather than the money itself, provided irrefutable, untraceable evidence of systemic stamp fraud across multiple major cities. This hard evidence confirmed the necessary truth. The conspiracy was national, orchestrated by the syndicate and protected from Washington. Bristow now faced the ultimate political hurdle. He had the proof, but he did not have the authority to strike without passing through the very man he knew was compromised. He had to convince President Grant to unleash the full force of the federal government on Grant's own friends. But here's the detail that truly matters. Bristow employed a strategy of psychological isolation. He understood Grant's fierce yet simple moral code. He knew that the president saw himself as an honest man betrayed by others. Bristow requested a private, unscheduled meeting with Grant, ensuring that Orville Babcock, the Sentinel, could not intercede or prime the president beforehand. This was a direct, high-stakes political ambush. In that meeting, Bristow did not offer opinions or accusations. He presented incontrovertible arithmetic and the physical evidence gathered by his secret agents. He detailed the tax shortfalls, the reused stamps, and the undeniable patterns of organized theft. He framed the case not as a political squabble, but as a direct insult to Grant's honor and a betrayal of the Union soldiers whose pensions the stolen money was meant to fund. Bristow gave Grant no space for political maneuvering, forcing him to choose between the lie of loyalty and the truth of the ledger. Pause and consider this image. Picture the moment of confrontation in the White House. Bristow, severe and calm, lays out the evidence, the ledgers, the coded messages, the agent reports. Grant, the great general, looks physically stunned, confronted by a conspiracy more insidious than any Confederate force. The room is silent, heavy with the weight of impending decision. Under this intense, focused pressure, Grant cracked. His military instincts, the demand for swift, decisive action against an enemy, took over. He issued the instruction that would become the mantra of the investigation, though tragically, he would later compromise it. Let no guilty man escape. Bristow secured the critical authorization, the power to strike without warning, bypassing all local officials and even the Attorney General, who was suspected of being too friendly with the ring. This was a medieval decree of absolute authority, placing the execution of justice entirely in the hands of the reformer. The psychological toll on Bristow was immense. He was now operating under a ticking clock, knowing that any slip, any leak would destroy him, discredit the president, and allow the conspirators to escape. He had to move with speed, secrecy, and overwhelming force. He decided on a course of action that was unprecedented in American history. A coordinated, simultaneous federal raid across multiple major cities, striking at the heart of the syndicate's network. This decision marked the true beginning of the war against the whiskey ring. Bristow, the quiet accountant, had transformed himself into the silent executioner, preparing to unleash a shockwave that would expose the rotten core of the Gilded Age to the terrified gaze of the American public. The fear was no longer about the crime itself, but the inevitability of exposure. The fortress of the whiskey ring was built on three pillars: stolen cash, coded silence, and the naive trust of the president. To destroy it, the reformer, Benjamin Bristow, had to strike at the exact center of this unholy trinity with the ultimate weapon: absolute, paralyzing surprise. Bristow possessed the president's fragile, whispered consent. Let no guilty man escape. But he knew that Orville Babcock, the president's man, remained a viper in the heart of the White House. Any official order for a raid, if sent through the normal chain of command, would be intercepted, decoded, and immediately relayed to John McDonald in St. Louis. The conspirators would vanish, the evidence burned. The execution of justice, therefore, had to be an act of covert war. Bristow initiated Operation Distiller, a maneuver so secret it bypassed the entire federal bureaucracy, functioning as a silent judicial coup. His strategy was military, born from the very war that had defined the era. He treated his agents, the quiet accountants and clerks he had sworn to secrecy, as a commando unit. He divided the targets into multiple simultaneous strikes across the major nodes of the conspiracy: St. Louis, Chicago, Milwaukee, and New Orleans. The key was not just speed, but synchronization. The entire syndicate had to be dismantled in the same hour, preventing any one city from warning the next. But here is the detail that truly matters. The communication method was the most daring part of the plot. Bristow did not use the federal telegraph lines. He relied on a network of dedicated, absolutely loyal messengers who traveled by train and horse, carrying sealed orders and using code phrases known only to Bristow and his field commanders. The messages were physical, untraceable artifacts, bypassing the electronic surveillance of the corrupted government lines. Pause and consider this image. Picture a small, tense man, a Treasury agent disguised as a commercial traveler, boarding a midnight train bound for Chicago. Clutched in his inner coat pocket is a sealed plain envelope containing the orders to seize millions of dollars in untaxed spirits and arrest the city's most powerful political figures. The weight of the Republic rests on his secrecy and his speed. The psychological impact of this approach was twofold. For Bristow's agents, it generated an intense shared sense of righteous paranoia. They knew they were hunting fellow federal officials, and they understood that failure meant not just professional ruin, but likely imprisonment engineered by the powerful men they sought to expose. For the conspirators, the attack would come from an entirely unforeseen direction. They expected a paper audit, a bureaucratic annoyance. They would receive a lightning bolt of medieval retribution. The chosen hour for the strike was Monday, May 10, 1875, a seemingly arbitrary morning, chosen precisely because it lacked any predictable political or financial significance. The element of surprise had to be total. As the hour approached, the atmosphere in Bristow's private office in Washington was one of breathless, terrifying silence. There was no official record of the impending action, no preparation for the enormous political shockwave about to hit the Capitol. Bristow had launched his force into the dark, trusting only in the honor of his few silent champions and the cold, hard reality of the numbers they had collected. The first crucial target was St. Louis, the fiefdom of John McDonald. McDonald, secure in his White House protection, felt invincible. He was surrounded by bought officials, confident that his syndicate was too vast and too politically charged to ever be touched. This arrogance was the final component of the conspiracy that Bristow aimed to crush. The shock had to be so absolute that the arrogance instantly transformed into paralyzing dread. The time for subtle investigation was over. The siege was about to begin. The strike was simultaneous, executed with the cold, brutal efficiency of a military campaign. On the morning of May 10, 1875, just as the industrial cities of the Midwest were stirring to life, Bristow's hand-picked agents, supported by U.S. Marshals who were brought into the loop only hours before the operation, descended upon the distilleries, rectifying houses and revenue offices. The shock was total. The conspirators, accustomed to years of high-level protection, were caught completely unaware. In St. Louis, the raid hit John McDonald's office and the major distilleries with overwhelming force. McDonald, the self-proclaimed president's man, was confronted not by a single auditor, but by a phalanx of federal agents with sealed search warrants and orders for seizure. The psychological collapse of the syndicate's chief was immediate and profound. His confidence, built on the assumption of political immunity, crumbled under the weight of tangible, undeniable evidence. The documents reveal a new kind of fear, the panic of the exposed predator. Agents seized ledgers that documented the true output of the distilleries, comparing them directly to the fraudulent official returns. They discovered hidden stamps, coded telegrams referencing sweeteners and mustard, and most critically, physical evidence of the apparatus used to peel and reuse tax stamps, the smoking gun of the fraud. The greatest psychological victory was the immediate seizure of the distillery stock. Thousands of barrels of untaxed whiskey, representing millions of dollars in stolen revenue, were physically confiscated and sealed by the government. This was the ultimate humiliation for the distillers. Their source of power, their industrial pride, was suddenly rendered inert. Their wealth, built on easy money, was locked down by the very system they thought they controlled. Pause and consider this image. Picture the distillery owner, moments before an undisputed master of commerce, watching federal agents affix new official seals, the symbols of law, to every single barrel in his warehouse. The air, once thick with the proud scent of profit, now carries the metallic tang of ruin and the cold realization of absolute defeat. The chaos spread like wildfire. In Chicago, New Orleans, and Milwaukee, the raids achieved the same devastating effect. The entire network, built on secrecy and communication, was paralyzed. The coded telegrams that had flowed so freely between the cities suddenly ceased. The agents, now under arrest, could not warn their political superiors. The invisible handshake had been severed by the sudden, physical force of the state. The immediate arrests included numerous high-ranking Treasury officials, the very men who were supposed to be guarding the national purse. The exposure of their betrayal struck the public consciousness like a thunderclap, fueling the deep-seated American anxiety about government betrayal and the corruption hiding beneath the veneer of official respectability. The secret was out. The conspiracy was broken. But the immediate aftermath presented Bristow with his biggest challenge. John McDonald, now under arrest, immediately played his final desperate card, the presidential connection. He demanded communication with Washington, certain that his friend Orville Babcock would swoop in and kill the prosecution. The success of Operation Distiller now hinged on whether Bristow could maintain the momentum and withstand the inevitable counterattack from the White House, the very place the conspiracy had been sheltered. The war for the truth had just begun, and the highest casualty would be the honor of the Grant administration. The shockwave that radiated outward from the raids of May 10, 1875, was not merely financial. It was psychological. The American public awoke to the horrifying reality that the government they trusted, the post-war order they had craved, was a carefully constructed lie. The invisible handshake had been exposed, leaving behind a trail of names that sent shivers of paranoia through the nation. Benjamin Bristow, the reformer, did not pause to savor his victory. He knew that the only way to withstand the inevitable political counterattack was to unleash the full, immediate weight of the judiciary. The evidence seized during Operation Distiller, the falsified ledgers, the coded telegrams, the stamp reusing apparatus, was rushed to the grand juries in St. Louis and Chicago. The process of unmasking the conspirators began with the reading of the indictments, and the names were staggering. The initial wave of indictments named over 200 individuals across the Midwestern circuit. These were not anonymous bandits or back alley thieves. They were the established aristocracy of the Gilded Age. Major distillery owners who sat on civic boards, prominent rectifiers who sponsored political campaigns, and most damningly, a host of high-ranking federal officials. The list included collectors of internal revenue, deputy collectors, supervising agents, and clerks, the entire medieval hierarchy of the Treasury Department in the Midwest. But here is the detail that truly matters. The man at the core of the St. Louis Syndicate, John McDonald, the self-proclaimed president's man, was the first and most prominent official indicted. His arrest, the stripping of his federal authority, was the ultimate psychological humiliation. The public saw the man who flaunted his wealth and his White House connection dragged into court on charges of conspiracy and massive fraud. The untouchable had been touched. The collective public shock was driven by the disparity between appearance and reality. These were the men who had demanded respect, who had given patriotic speeches, and who had often condemned others for lesser crimes. Now they were revealed to be common thieves, using the prestige of their government positions to steal the funds meant for the national debt and the veterans' pensions. Pause and consider this image. Picture the front page of a major American newspaper in May 1875. The headlines scream, "Whiskey Thieves," beneath a stark image of the St. Louis Customs House. The public sees the familiar faces of their civic leaders, the wealthy distillers and the stern-faced revenue officials, all branded as criminals. The betrayal is personalized, immediate, and utterly terrifying. The exposure fueled the core American anxiety of government betrayal. If the men tasked with collecting the nation's taxes, the most mundane, reliable function of the state, were secretly running a criminal cartel, what other parts of the government were infected? The paranoia spread to the courts, the post office, and the customs houses. Trust in the entire system was evaporating overnight. Bristow, meanwhile, was faced with the immediate, aggressive defense of the conspirators. They did not rely on legal arguments. They relied on political intimidation. They launched a vicious counter-campaign, using the newspapers they still controlled to paint Bristow as an ambitious fanatic, a political opportunist, and, most potently, as an enemy of President Grant's friends. They attempted to shift the narrative from their corruption to Bristow's supposed disloyalty. This counterattack only intensified the public's fear. The thieves were powerful enough to fight the government, even from behind bars. The emotional escalation was driven by the knowledge that the battle for justice was far from over. It was merely moving from the streets of St. Louis to the political battlefield of Washington. The scale of the indictments proved the depth of the rot, but the power of the indicted proved the difficulty of the cure. The shock of the initial indictments was just the tremor. The earthquake arrived when the investigation, guided by Bristow, began to reveal the syndicate's Washington connection. The public realization that the corruption extended directly into the inner sanctum of the White House delivered a crushing blow to the national psyche. The evidence seized in the raids, particularly the coded telegrams and the money transfer records, pointed inexorably to the highest echelon of Grant's personal staff. The indictments were slowly, terrifyingly climbing the ladder of authority. The American people, still reeling from the exposure of their local officials, now faced the prospect of the ultimate governmental betrayal, the corruption of the president's own private secretary. The political establishment in Washington initially dismissed the raids as a Midwestern political squabble, but the sheer volume of high-profile arrests, federal officials, prominent businessmen made denial impossible. The mood in Congress shifted from skeptical indifference to panicked self-preservation. Every politician who had accepted a campaign contribution from the Midwest suddenly felt the cold touch of paranoia. But here is the detail that truly matters. The psychological fear introduced by the impending indictment of a White House aide was the fear of systemic vulnerability. If the president's personal secretary could be bought by whiskey thieves, then where in the vast mechanism of the federal government could an honest citizen find sanctuary? The integrity of the entire executive branch hung in the balance. The initial defense strategy of the conspirators was pure medieval loyalty theater. MacDonald, from his jail cell, insisted he was a victim of a partisan witch hunt, a casualty of his unwavering friendship with President Grant. He believed, and desperately needed the public to believe, that his connection to Grant would save him. This was the final, desperate weapon of the syndicate, exploiting the president's heart. Pause and consider this image. Picture a newspaper political cartoon showing the figure of America, a noble woman weeping as she sees two hands, one stained with whiskey and the other holding a White House key, shaking under the table. This image encapsulates the betrayal. The highest trust has been traded for the lowest greed. The psychological pressure on President Grant was now immense. He had given Bristow the order, "Let no guilty man escape," but he was being confronted with the chilling possibility that the guilty man was his friend. His trusted confidant, the man who poured his morning coffee. Bristow had successfully used the shock of the indictments to force the crisis to the president's doorstep, bypassing Babcock's initial shield. The emotional escalation was built on the public's demand for accountability versus the president's refusal to believe in betrayal. Grant initially maintained that the indicted men were merely unfortunate friends who had been misled. He struggled to reconcile the image of the loyal comrades he trusted with the evidence of them being financial traitors. This denial was seen by the conspirators as their final opportunity for survival. The indictments achieved their primary psychological goal. They forced the entire nation to confront the fragility of the human mind and power. They proved that the line between hero and dupe, between loyalty and moral blindness, was terrifyingly thin. The high retention hook was set. The people needed to know if their hero, Ulysses S. Grant, would finally face the awful truth and allow justice to consume his own house. The process of unmasking was nearly complete. The conspiracy had been revealed in its terrifying scale, hundreds of individuals, millions of stolen dollars, and the ultimate link to the White House. But the most significant and most dangerous indictment was yet to be filed. The shadow of Orville Babcock still loomed over the entire apparatus of justice, and his fall would define the very meaning of the whiskey ring. The White House, the symbol of the nation's unwavering authority, was now shrouded in a shadow of its own making. The shockwave from the secret raids and the ensuing indictments, naming over 200 federal officials and businessmen, had finally crashed against the walls of the executive mansion. But the president, Ulysses S. Grant, did not react with the righteous fury of a sovereign betrayed. He reacted with the crippling denial of a man facing a painful personal truth. Grant's initial reflexive response to the scandal was not to investigate, but to defend. His moral architecture was simple. Trust was absolute and friendship was sacred. He viewed the accusations against his appointees, men like John MacDonald and those close to the Republican machine, not as evidence of systemic corruption, but as a continuation of the political war against his administration. He saw the accusers, even the virtuous Benjamin Bristow, as ambitious rivals rather than crusaders for justice. This psychological rigidity was the whiskey ring's ultimate shield. They knew Grant would choose the comfort of loyalty over the complexity of truth. His refusal to believe in the betrayal was the final act of plausible deniability the conspiracy needed. But here is the detail that truly matters. Grant's evasion was rooted in the battlefield. As general, his orders were followed unquestioningly. He rewarded those who served him with absolute, unconditional trust. He could not comprehend that the same men who showed unwavering loyalty during the war could be venal thieves in peace. The deep irony is that the quality that saved the Union, Grant's stubborn loyalty to his command, was now the quality that threatened to destroy the integrity of his presidency. He actively sought to minimize the scandal. He publicly dismissed the accusations as mere treasury troubles, suggesting they were simple bureaucratic errors, not organized crime. This denial was a desperate attempt to contain the psychological fallout, to prevent the public from facing the horrifying reality that the post-war government was rotten to the core. Pause and consider this image. Picture Grant, sitting in the silence of the White House library, nervously thumbing through a report that details the millions stolen. He is trying to force the evidence to conform to his simple worldview. My friends are not thieves. The heavy draperies and ornate furniture of the office seem to press in on him, symbols of the political complexity he can no longer control. The atmosphere inside the White House became one of deep, institutional dread. Bristow, the Secretary of the Treasury, was fighting a war on two fronts: the open battle against the indicted conspirators and the silent, terrifying war against his own superior, the President. Every move Bristow made had to be calculated not only to secure evidence, but to bypass the President's denial. The political pressure was unbearable. The conspirators, leveraging the newspapers they still controlled and the political allies they had funded, besieged the White House with pleas for clemency and accusations against Bristow. They appealed directly to Grant's honor, manipulating his core belief that an attack on his friend was an attack on him. This emotional blackmail was their final weapon against justice. The documents reveal a new kind of fear, the fear of selective blindness. Grant was being shown the raw figures, the proof of the stamp fraud and the telegrams. Yet his mind was actively filtering the facts to maintain his emotional equilibrium. He could accept that subordinates were corrupt, but he could not accept that his personal system of selecting those subordinates was flawed, or that his most intimate confidant was a traitor. This psychological evasion created the White House's shadow, a deep, oppressive gloom of moral paralysis hanging over the seat of American power. The fate of the entire investigation now rested on whether Grant would finally allow the light of truth to breach the darkness of his own denial. The climax of Grant's internal struggle arrived when the evidence began to point directly at the innermost circle, specifically at Orville E. Babcock. The raids had broken the code, and the evidence now showed a clear, continuous chain of command from the St. Louis syndicate to the president's desk. Bristow, with quiet, grim determination, delivered the evidence implicating Babcock to the president. This was the moment of supreme reckoning. The general was finally forced to choose between the integrity of the Republic and the comfort of his most trusted aide. Grant's reaction was a study in psychological retreat. He did not immediately fire Babcock or endorse his indictment. Instead, he attempted a series of desperate, politically ruinous maneuvers to maintain his denial. He tried to have the investigation transferred to the War Department, where he believed his military authority would guarantee a clean acquittal for Babcock. He resisted every attempt by Bristow to treat the case as simple, egregious theft. But here is the detail that truly matters. Grant initially refused to believe the evidence, famously stating that he would sooner believe that Benjamin Bristow was connected to the scandal than Babcock. This statement revealed the depth of his delusion. He preferred to indict the reformer rather than accept the corruption of his own personal judgment. This blind spot was the moral scar of his presidency. The resulting political tension created a deep, chilling split in the executive branch. Bristow, the Secretary of the Treasury, was forced into open opposition to the president's personal will. He continued to pursue the evidence against Babcock, operating with the knowledge that his own president was actively, if indirectly, seeking to undermine his investigation. This was the ultimate government betrayal. The system was not being destroyed by the thieves, but by the hero who refused to stop them. Pause and consider this image. Picture a medieval king, seated on his throne, refusing to believe the honest magistrate who brings him proof of treason, choosing instead to trust the whispering courtier who stands behind his chair. This is Grant and Babcock. The failure of the president to see the obvious truth due to a fatal personal dependency. Grant's evasion and denial had immediate, corrosive consequences. His reluctance empowered the conspirators' legal teams. It gave rise to the chilling public fear that justice could be bought, even after the raid. The scandal became the defining narrative of the Gilded Age, a story of how corporate greed and political cronyism could render the institutions of democracy utterly impotent. The American audience anxiety, the fear that the government is inherently rigged, was entirely confirmed by Grant's actions. Even when the evidence became overwhelming, Grant continued to shield Babcock, offering him repeated opportunities to resign quietly or explain his actions. The president's hesitation sent a clear signal to the entire political machine. Loyalty would be rewarded, even loyalty to criminals. The psychological cost to the nation was immense. The high hopes of Reconstruction, the belief that the Union had been purified by war, were shattered. They had survived secession only to be destroyed by self-interest. Grant, the great general, failed not on the field of battle but in the intimate quiet war against his own internal shadow. His denial cast a pall over the entire administration, ensuring that even when the guilty were finally brought to trial, the legitimacy of the process would forever be questioned. The previous segment detailed President Grant's paralyzing denial. This segment, the most damaging link. Orville Babcock, the private secretary, delivers the final crippling blow to the White House's integrity. We must establish Babcock as the embodiment of treason by proximity and detail his indictment and the political chaos he caused, maintaining the continuity and escalating the sense of internal dread. We will reach the 2,000-word target across two parts. The most damaging link. Orville Babcock, the private secretary, Part 1, word count approximately 1,000 words. The whiskey ring was a body of corruption, and John MacDonald was its greedy heart. But the nerve center, the brain that granted it immunity and orchestrated its defense, resided 30 feet from the president's bedchamber. That nerve center was Orville E. Babcock, private secretary to Ulysses S. Grant. Babcock was the most dangerous link because his power was not structural. It was intimate. He possessed the absolute, unquestioned trust of the president, a currency far more valuable than the millions stolen by the syndicate. He was the sentinel of the White House, and he willingly opened the gates to the thieves. His involvement transformed the fraud from a large-scale tax crime into an act of high political treason. The evidence seized during Operation Distiller, the coded telegrams from MacDonald, the documented money transfers disguised as gifts, all pointed an irrefutable finger at Babcock. The language used in these messages, referring to deliveries and mustard destined for the chief, Babcock's code name, detailed a criminal partnership operating literally at the apex of American power. The documents reveal a new kind of fear. The terrifying simplicity of the conspiracy's highest defense. Babcock did not need to issue detailed orders. He merely needed to exercise selective neglect. A file from an honest Treasury agent would vanish. A request for a warrant would be misplaced. An honest official who got too close would find himself abruptly transferred to a distant, irrelevant post. Justice was not challenged. It was smothered by a quiet man sitting at the president's elbow. The psychological betrayal represented by Babcock was immense. He was a war hero, a trusted military aide, and now he was revealed as a common criminal who exploited his master's loyalty for profit. He was the ultimate pattern interrupt to the public's image of the post-war government. The realization that the danger lay not in the defeated South, but in the trusted inner circle of the victorious North. Pause and consider this image. Picture Babcock's handsome, polished face always present at Grant's side during public functions. This image of unwavering support was the mask over a cold, calculating mind. He used the prestige of the presidency as camouflage, making his crimes the least detectable within the entire conspiracy. The American anxiety about the unseen elite working against the common interest was utterly validated by Babcock's treachery. But here is the detail that truly matters. Babcock's indictment was not merely a legal proceeding. It was an act of profound political violence. Benjamin Bristow and his prosecutors understood that indicting the president's personal secretary would force the executive branch into an unprecedented crisis. They knew the emotional cost to Grant, but they also knew that justice could not stop at the steps of the White House. The grand jury, presented with the overwhelming evidence, including confessions and deciphered telegrams, filed the indictment against Orville Babcock. The charge was conspiracy to defraud the United States government. The official delivery of the indictment to the White House created an atmosphere of frozen dread. The nation's most trusted home had been officially branded a criminal sanctuary. The indictment was a direct confrontation of Grant's deepest personal vulnerability, a brutal challenge to his faith in his own judgment. The medieval narrative was complete. The trusted Chamberlain was a traitor, and the king was now forced to deal with the treason in his own court. Babcock was immediately relieved of his duties, but he was not abandoned. Grant's immediate, almost panicked reaction was to mobilize the vast power of his office to shield his friend. He could not accept the indictment's truth. To do so was to accept his own failure as a judge of men. Babcock's indictment triggered the final, most desperate phase of the White House defense. The disgraced secretary immediately turned to his patron, leveraging the full weight of their shared history and personal bond. He pleaded innocence, claiming the charges were a political vendetta orchestrated by Bristow, designed to destroy the president's authority. Grant, blinded by his loyalty and desperate to cling to his simple vision of trust, made a decision that shocked the nation and poisoned the judicial process. He inserted himself directly into the defense of the accused. In a move utterly without precedent, President Grant issued a signed public statement vouching for Babcock's innocence. This presidential declaration was a clear, unambiguous attempt to pollute the jury pool and coerce the Justice Department. It signaled to every potential juror, every judge, and every honest official that the case against Babcock was, in the president's view, illegitimate. The highest office in the land was actively campaigning to shield a man indicted for grand larceny against the state.
But here is the detail that truly matters. Grant did not stop there. He then offered to appear as a character witness at Babcock's upcoming trial in St. Louis. The sitting president of the United States, volunteering to travel across the country to testify on behalf of a man accused of stealing millions from the federal treasury, was an act of self-destructive loyalty that defies modern comprehension. It confirmed the terrifying power of the White House shadow. The president valued his friend's reputation over the nation's integrity. Picture the front pages. President to testify. The sheer audacity of the move paralyzes the public. It confirms their deepest anxieties, that the rule of law bows before the will of power, and that justice is truly for sale to the highest bidder or the best connected friend. The psychological impact on the prosecution team, led by Bristow, was immense. They were now pitted not just against a clever criminal defense, but against the personal authority and emotional power of the president himself. The trial was no longer about facts. It was about whether a jury could withstand the immense pressure of contradicting Ulysses S. Grant. Babcock, though disgraced, suddenly regained his confidence. His arrogance was restored, knowing that his defense had a presidential mandate. He used Grant's public and private support as his new shield, walking into the courtroom with the implicit protection of the highest office in the land. The medieval dread was palpable. The king's seal was being used to endorse treason. The eventual trial of Babcock became the focal point of the entire whiskey ring scandal, not because of the complexity of the crime, but because of the moral simplicity of the betrayal by the man who was supposed to be the nation's ethical guide. Babcock, the ultimate product of cronyism and misplaced faith, represented the failure of the American experiment in the Gilded Age. The stage was now perfectly set for the courtroom confrontation. Bristow, the relentless reformer, had to find a way to dismantle the psychological shield that Grant had personally constructed around Babcock. The ultimate battle for the soul of the Republic would not be fought on the streets of St. Louis or the halls of the Treasury, but within the confines of a small, tense courtroom where the testimony of the president hung heavy in the air. The words were spoken in a moment of clarity and righteous anger, a brief, shining echo of the general who demanded unconditional surrender. When Benjamin Bristow first confronted President Ulysses S. Grant with the evidence of the whiskey ring, the hero's instinct was pure. Let no guilty man escape. This was the mandate that launched Operation Distiller, the phrase that promised the American people swift and impartial justice. But a promise is fragile, especially when weighed against the immense, suffocating pressure of the political machine. The moment the indictments touched the White House, specifically the moment Orville Babcock was charged, that noble mandate began to fray, its heroic luster fading under the heat of presidential anguish and partisan defense. Grant's initial commitment clashed violently with his tragic flaw, his inability to believe that his trusted subordinates were capable of systemic treachery. The conspirators, masters of psychological warfare, understood this vulnerability perfectly. They immediately mobilized a campaign of political and emotional blackmail aimed directly at the president's heart. The documents reveal a new kind of fear, the dread that the president himself would become the greatest obstacle to justice. Grant was besieged not just by friends of the indicted, but by the highest echelons of the Republican Party. These politicians, many of whom had benefited directly from the whiskey ring's campaign contributions, argued that the prosecution was a political vendetta, a Democratic plot designed to destroy the hero of the Union. They manipulated his loyalty, framing the pursuit of justice as an act of political self-destruction. But here is the detail that truly matters. The price of maintaining the no guilty man escape promise was the political annihilation of his own administration. Grant was forced to choose between clean government and the survival of the Republican Party in the vital post-war elections. He chose the latter, slowly allowing his initial vow to be corrupted by the cold calculus of power. Picture the White House doors besieged by angry Republican senators, faces tight with fury, demanding that Grant call off the fanatic Bristow. They're not arguing the innocence of the indicted, they're arguing the necessity of political survival. Grant, weary and isolated, is forced to watch his heroic image be dismantled piece by piece by the very party he leads. The pressure manifested in a chilling series of attempts to subvert the investigation. Grant sought to place restrictions on Bristow, attempting to control the flow of information and protect certain key figures. He actively resisted the removal of officials who were clearly implicated but held powerful political sway. The honest reformer was fighting not just the criminals, but the internal resistance of the presidency itself. The public, who had cheered the initial raids, now watched with growing anxiety as the White House became a bastion of defense for the accused. Grant's inaction, his repeated defenses of Babcock, and his refusal to condemn the corruption unequivocally sent a devastating psychological signal across the nation. The powerful will always protect their own. The promise was fading. The hero was compromising. The hope for a clean slate, born in the aftermath of the Civil War, was dying a slow, agonizing death on the altar of political expediency. The integrity of the presidency was being sacrificed to shield the guiltiest man closest to the throne. The moral compromise forced on President Grant was absolute. While he never directly ordered Bristow to halt the prosecutions of the major distillers, he ensured that the political environment was toxic and unsustainable for the reformer. The constant pressure, the subtle undermining of authority, and the open defense of Babcock were designed to make Bristow's position untenable. The most damaging and enduring action taken by Grant, aside from his vocal support of Babcock, was his refusal to fully support the Justice Department's efforts to clean house. The president's hesitation created a chilling effect that spread through the entire federal system. Why should a prosecutor or a judge risk their career for justice when the president himself was actively trying to shield the accused? The medieval dread returned. Justice was a matter of the king's unpredictable favor, not the rule of law. But here is the detail that truly matters. The inevitable result of Grant's fading promise was the departure of Benjamin Bristow. Unable to continue fighting both the syndicate and the president, Bristow resigned as Secretary of the Treasury in June 1876. His resignation was a profound public signal that the White House had abandoned the moral high ground. The hero who had successfully executed the raids and secured the indictments was forced out by the hero who had promised him support. Bristow's departure was the final, visible compromise of the Grant administration. It confirmed the darkest suspicions of the American populace, that no matter how righteous the cause, the entrenched power of corruption, protected by political necessity, would ultimately prevail over individual integrity. The promise, "Let no guilty man escape," now rang hollow, a cruel echo of a failed ideal. Picture the empty desk of Benjamin Bristow in the Treasury Department. The man who nearly saved the Republic from its own government is gone, forced out by the very authority that should have protected him. The files remain, the evidence is intact, but the will to prosecute has been politically neutralized. The quiet dread of systemic failure settles back over Washington. The psychological consequence of this fading promise was the institutionalization of cynicism. The American audience anxiety, the fear of government betrayal, was no longer a suspicion. It was a confirmed fact. The whiskey ring scandal and Grant's reaction to it taught the nation that power was above the law, and that loyalty trumped all other virtues, including honesty. Grant's personal tragedy was complete. He entered the presidency as the nation's savior, a figure of uncompromising morality. He left it as a man whose greatest error was a deep, fatal inability to see treachery in those he loved. He had won the war against secession, but he had catastrophically lost the war against his own inner shadow. The trial of Orville Babcock would proceed, but the deck was already stacked. The moral authority of the prosecution was severely damaged by the president's actions. The courtroom confrontation was no longer a simple legal contest. It was a desperate final stand for the principle of accountability, made all the more difficult by the president's personal defense of the man who had disgraced him. The promise had faded, but the fight was not quite dead. The courtroom in St. Louis became the final unforgiving battlefield of the whiskey ring. This was no ordinary legal contest. It was a desperate public trial of the American conscience. Officially, the court was prosecuting Orville E. Babcock, the president's private secretary, and the ringleaders of the St. Louis Syndicate, including John McDonald. Unofficially, the prosecution, though led by the Justice Department, was fighting the entire political will of the Grant administration.
The very atmosphere of the trial was thick with political intimidation. The prosecution, though technically led by new federal attorneys, was spiritually commanded by the ideals of the departed Benjamin Bristow. Bristow had armed the court with irrefutable evidence, the coded telegrams, the seized ledgers, the physical tools of stamp fraud. But the defense came armed with something far more potent, the unconditional support of the sitting President of the United States. This was the core psychological conflict of the trial, evidence versus loyalty. The defense team, composed of the best and most politically connected lawyers in the country, did not waste time arguing the facts of the excise tax. They focused entirely on dismantling the credibility of the prosecution. They framed the case as a political feud, a betrayal by Bristow and his associates aimed at discrediting President Grant to secure the next presidential nomination. The anxiety of the American audience, the fear of a rigged political system, was the defense's greatest ally. But here is the detail that truly matters. The greatest threat to the prosecution was not legal, but symbolic. The defense announced that the President of the United States, Ulysses S. Grant, had given a sworn deposition in support of Babcock. Though Grant did not travel to St. Louis, his words, taken under oath in the White House, were read aloud in the courtroom. This was the moment the trial shifted from a crime case to a referendum on the presidency. Picture the courtroom, packed, hushed, the heavy summer air hanging still. The defense attorney, standing erect, reads the president's sworn testimony, a document signed by the hero of the Union, vouching for the innocence of the accused. The sheer weight of the commander-in-chief's testimony hangs over the jurors, a silent, powerful instruction to acquit. Grant's testimony painted Babcock as an honest, hard-working aide targeted by malicious political enemies. It offered a seemingly unimpeachable narrative of trust and competence. This presidential intervention was a massive act of psychological coercion, effectively asking the jury, "Do you dare call the President of the United States a liar?" The prosecution's entire case threatened to collapse under the gravity of Grant's defense. The evidence of coded messages, stamp fraud, and millions stolen suddenly felt abstract and small compared to the physical presence of the president's sworn word. The public, reading the transcript, was forced into a cognitive dissonance. Either the great hero was morally blind, or the tireless reformer was a liar. The pressure on the jury was immense, and the trial became a medieval spectacle of power versus principle. The prosecution needed a powerful, unexpected countermeasure to neutralize the psychological advantage granted to Babcock by the president. They had the hard evidence of the crime, but they needed a human voice, a confessor, to break the spell of presidential loyalty. The prosecution, fighting the full weight of the executive branch and the shadow of the president's testimony, made their last desperate stand. They needed to personalize the betrayal, to give the jurors a visceral sense of the syndicate's rot that transcended the political abstractions of the White House. They called their surprise witness, Myron Colony. Colony was a former chief clerk in the Treasury Department, a man deeply involved in the syndicate's operations who had turned informant. His testimony was the human counterpoint to Grant's deposition. Colony did not speak of loyalty or politics. He spoke of cash, code words, and direct exchanges with John McDonald and, crucially, the system for sending funds to Orville Babcock. His account was chilling in its detail. He described the mundane mechanics of massive theft, how money was packaged, how the coded telegrams were deciphered, and how the entire criminal enterprise relied on the absolute assurance that Babcock was the final stop on the political line. Colony's testimony put a face to the betrayal and gave the jurors permission to doubt the presidential narrative. The documents revealed a new kind of fear, the terror of betrayal among thieves. Colony's evidence, though compromised by his own guilt, corroborated the coded messages perfectly, showing the jury the entire architecture of the conspiracy, built on fraud and political corruption. But here is the detail that truly matters. Even with Colony's devastating testimony and the mountain of physical evidence, the political gravity exerted by President Grant was insurmountable. The trial had been poisoned from the moment the president's deposition was read. The defense's closing argument was simple. Yes, there was corruption, but Babcock was merely a dupe, a loyal soldier betrayed by criminal associates. The unspoken subtext remained. To convict Babcock is to shame the president. Picture the jury, faces drawn with exhaustion and internal conflict. They hold the undeniable truth of the evidence in one hand and the immense, unspoken pressure of the presidency in the other. Their decision will not just free or convict a man, it will define whether justice in America truly transcends political power. After days of agonizing deliberation, the jury returned the verdict on Orville E. Babcock, not guilty. The courtroom erupted in a wave of suppressed political triumph from the defense and a wave of crushing disappointment from the prosecution. The verdict was not a declaration of Babcock's innocence. Historians generally agree the evidence of his guilt was overwhelming, but a declaration of the president's influence. The jury, under the immense psychological coercion of the White House, had chosen to preserve the image of the hero, Ulysses S. Grant, over the principles of accountability. The corruption of the Gilded Age had claimed its most significant victory. The verdict marked the tragic final compromise of the entire Whiskey Ring saga. While over 200 individuals were successfully prosecuted and convicted, including the syndicate's ringleader, John McDonald, the man at the center of the political web walked free. The core anxiety of the American audience was brutally confirmed. When the crime reaches the highest office, the rules of justice cease to apply. The political machine, fueled by stolen money, proved more powerful than the evidence gathered by the most honest man in government. The promise, "Let no guilty man escape," was broken. The reformer, Benjamin Bristow, was gone. The man of the president was free. The trial of the century was over, leaving behind a nation profoundly skeptical of its leaders and desperately searching for a moral anchor that the Grant administration could no longer provide. Orville Babcock walked free. The jury's acquittal was not a finding of innocence, but a final, bitter testament to the power of the White House shadow. The verdict confirmed the most profound fear of the Gilded Age American, that political loyalty transcended justice, and the powerful could always buy their freedom. The Whiskey Ring trials, while ultimately failing to convict the most politically connected figure, were not without consequence. Over 230 individuals were indicted and more than 110 were successfully convicted, a staggering tally of Treasury officials, federal agents, and distillers who served time in prison. John McDonald, the ringleader of the St. Louis Syndicate, was found guilty and sentenced to a significant term. The criminal operation, built on years of silent theft, was physically dismantled. But the true, lasting impact of the Whiskey Ring was not measured in convictions. It was measured in the shattered morale of the Republic. The price of trust was paid in the coin of widespread, permanent cynicism regarding the American government. The scandal was the final, devastating blow to the idealism of Reconstruction. It taught the generation that survived the Civil War a terrible lesson. The government was not a moral force, but a corruptible machine, designed not to serve the people, but to enrich its operators. The emotional inheritance of the Whiskey Ring was paranoia, the enduring belief that invisible conspiracies were always operating at the highest levels of power. The documents revealed a new kind of fear, the dread of systemic failure. The public realized that the failure was not localized, it ran through the entire administrative spine of the nation. The money stolen, an estimated $3 million annually, tens of billions in modern value, was the literal bloodline drained from the economy, money that should have funded schools, roads, and veterans' benefits. The corruption was not an abstract political problem, it was a direct assault on the quality of American life. Picture the National Treasury in Washington, once seen as the unbreakable vault of the people. Now visualize it as a massive, intricate sieve leaking gold into the private pockets of corrupt officials. This image of uncontained financial hemorrhage defines the psychological reality of the post-scandal era. The political legacy was immediately brutal for Ulysses S. Grant. He had entered the presidency as the nation's savior. he left it as the leader of the most scandal-plagued administration in American history up to that point. His personal image, once sanctisanct, was indelibly stained by the perception of moral blindness and misplaced loyalty. While he was personally innocent of the theft, his political sins, his stubborn defense of Babcock, and his failure to uphold his own mandate, "Let no guilty man escape," were unforgivable in the eyes of the public.
The political system responded with a deep internal fracturing. The Republican Party, facing massive public backlash, was forced to confront the necessity of reform. The old system of patronage, where government jobs were handed out as political rewards to men like John MacDonald, was suddenly exposed as a direct path to national ruin. The medieval fiefdom of political appointments had proven too dangerous for the modern state. The departure of Benjamin Bristow cemented the cost of integrity. Bristow, the honest reformer, had sacrificed his political career for the pursuit of justice, only to be neutralized by the president he tried to protect. His fate served as a chilling warning to future officials. Righteousness comes with a price, and that price is often exile. The narrative of the courageous individual fighting the corrupt system, a core American myth, had ended in bitter defeat. The only recourse was to change the system itself. The sheer audacity and scale of the whiskey ring forced the government to acknowledge a terrifying truth. The administrative state was fundamentally broken. The old system, relying on political appointees and personal trust, was utterly incapable of managing the vast, complex revenues of an industrializing nation. The primary systemic response to the scandal was the reluctant, gradual adoption of civil service reform. Before the ring, jobs in the Treasury and customs houses were spoils of war, awarded to political allies. The whiskey ring proved that this patronage system was not merely inefficient, it was a Trojan horse for criminal enterprise. The resulting pressure, combined with later assassinations tied to the spoils system, eventually led to legislation demanding that federal jobs be based on merit and professional qualifications rather than political fealty. The era of the easily corrupted political crony, the John MacDonald archetype, was slowly, agonizingly drawing to a close. But here is the detail that truly matters. The Treasury Department itself underwent a massive, painful structural overhaul. Bristow's initial discovery, the simple mathematical impossibility of the revenue reports, led to the establishment of far more robust accounting practices, independent auditing procedures, and centralized financial controls. The government learned that paper controls were insufficient. It needed independent oversight to verify the physical reality of the excise tax, just as Bristow's secret agents had done. The whiskey ring inadvertently gave birth to the strict, centralized administrative regulations that define the modern federal bureaucracy. The scandal also permanently altered the relationship between the press and the presidency. The unmasking of the conspirators was largely driven by honest, aggressive investigative journalism that reported the facts even as the White House sought to control the narrative. The whiskey ring trials established the precedent for the press as the fourth estate, a necessary adversarial check on executive power. The American audience anxiety, the need for a powerful force outside the government to reveal corruption, was finally given an institutional champion. Pause and consider this image. Picture a long, winding bureaucratic process being constructed. New laws, new certifications, new audit requirements. These dry, tedious regulations are the physical scars of the whiskey ring's betrayal, a cold, systemic defense against the warm, corrupting force of misplaced trust. The final, enduring impact of the whiskey ring is its terrifying resonance with contemporary American anxieties. The core themes of the Gilded Age, corporate greed infiltrating the government, the political elite operating under a shield of immunity, and the public's feeling of helplessness against unseen powerful forces, are not history, they are enduring shadows. The acquittal of Orville Babcock serves as a permanent historical echo, confirming the fear that wealth and proximity to power can effectively nullify the rule of law. The price of trust was paid in the loss of American innocence. The whiskey ring stripped away the high hopes of Reconstruction and replaced them with the harsh, cynical reality of the Gilded Age. The promise of the hero, Ulysses S. Grant, had faded, but the relentless, methodical work of the reformer, Benjamin Bristow, forced the system to evolve. The scandal remains a chilling, potent historical mystery defined by the failure of a great man's loyalty and the chilling birth of the modern struggle for governmental accountability. The watchword of the Gilded Age, born from the stench of untaxed liquor and stolen gold, remains: trust nothing, audit everything.